In Georgian Britain, good breeding was social currency, and politeness evolved into a weapon of class warfare. The 18th century was an age obsessed with refinement, when how you spoke, walked, ate, and even sneezed determined your place in the world. It wasn't enough to be good. You had to look good while being good. Appearances weren't superficial, they were your resume. If you sneezed wrong, someone somewhere would write a pamphlet about your lack of refinement. This was the dawn of what historians call the Age of Politeness. But to live through it was like starring in a reality show judged entirely on posture. Britain, flush with Enlightenment ideas and new wealth, became a laboratory for manners. The upper and middle classes decided that civilization itself depended on how delicately one handled a teacup. To be polite wasn't just about being nice, it was a moral statement. A declaration that you were civilized, rational, and most importantly, not femme or French. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In this world, etiquette books were sacred texts. Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's The Spectator taught readers how to think and speak like polite gentlemen, while Lord Chesterfield's letters to his son became a crash course in how to disguise arrogance as elegance. Every sentence, gesture, and eyebrow raise was studied, rehearsed, and perfected. The result? A society where no one said what they meant, but everyone looked marvellous doing it. Walking down a Georgian street meant entering a ballet of restraint. You bowed to your betters, nodded to your equals, and pretended not to see your inferiors. Everything had a rule. Even laughter had to be moderate and musical. Anything too loud risked sounding vulgar. The British smile, now famous for its polite awkwardness, was born here. An expression that says, "I despise you, but I'm too well-mannered to show it." Manners became the great equalizer and the great divider. The newly rising middle class, enriched by trade, desperately wanted to imitate the nobility. They read etiquette manuals like survival guides, terrified of being exposed as commoners. Meanwhile, the aristocracy grew ever more inventive in finding new rules to keep everyone else out. Fork placement, glove etiquette, carriage entrances, all became invisible tripwires in the social minefield. And this wasn't just about social success, it was national identity engineering. The British elite viewed politeness as proof of moral superiority, a kind of armour against the perceived chaos of the lower classes and the emotional volatility of other nations. It was reason triumphing over passion, calm over chaos, restraint over reality. The result was a population so trained in self-control that they could probably host a dinner party during an earthquake without spilling their tea. But beneath the powdered wigs and powdered faces, something else was happening. Politeness was exhausting. It demanded constant vigilance, a 24/7 performance. People began to confuse genuine kindness with the appearance of civility. Being polite didn't mean being honest. It meant saying everything except what you thought. Want to insult someone? Do it politely. Your dancing was most amusing might sound like praise, but it's Georgian for you looked like a startled chicken. Every encounter became a chess game. Hosts competed for refinement like generals for glory. Dinner invitations were strategic alliances. One misused spoon could sink a reputation. If your servant announced you too loudly, if your bow lingered too long, if your laughter revealed too many teeth, you might as well move to the countryside and start over. And then there were the manuals, endless guides for the socially anxious. The polite lady, the gentleman's pocket companion, rules for behaviour in company, each promised to transform readers into paragons of grace. They warned against everything from eating too quickly to walking with too much vigour. Essentially, if you looked like you enjoyed life, you were doing it wrong. The irony was that politeness, meant to create harmony, often created neurosis. People became so afraid of appearing impolite that they stopped being human. Genuine emotion was dangerous, spontaneity was barbaric. Smiling too often was gauche, showing excitement was childish. Even grief was expected to be tasteful. It's no wonder Georgian portraits look so calm. They were painted by people terrified of expressing too much. This obsession didn't stop at home. It trickled into politics, education, even science. Politeness was the Georgian version of public relations. Politicians used it to appear rational and moral, even when being neither. Scholars cultivated it to seem objective, and social climbers wielded it like a sword, smiling sweetly while cutting rivals to ribbons. By the mid-1700s, the entire nation was caught in the manners machine. From Bath to London, everyone performed civility as if life itself were an endless masquerade. But behind the fans and wigs and powdered calm, something fragile was forming, a society where appearance mattered more than sincerity, and where charm often hid cruelty. So welcome to Georgian Britain, where people didn't just live, they performed life. Where conversation was choreography, gestures were rehearsed, and even compassion came with a curtsy. The good news, everyone looked incredibly polite. The bad news, no one could relax. The early 18th century didn't just invent the tea table and powdered wig, it invented the concept of being civilized on purpose. The phrase polite society wasn't just descriptive, it was aspirational. It was the glittering illusion that good manners could make Britain more enlightened, more moral, and frankly, more tolerable to be in. The Enlightenment had told people that reason, order, and refinement were the future, and the Georgians took that as permission to turn not bumping into each other into a moral philosophy. You didn't need a soul, you just needed impeccable table manners. At its heart, politeness became the great terminal invention of the century, a fusion of moral restraint, intellectual sophistication, and a suspicious amount of fear about appearing common. Philosophers like Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, argued that politeness was the key to balancing reason and emotion. It was how one proved their humanity. According to him, a well-mannered person wasn't just refined, they were morally elevated. Translation: empathy now had an entrance exam. This philosophy took hold among the rising middle class, who were desperate to prove they weren't just merchants with money, they were gentlemen with manners. The old feudal order had been fading, and money alone no longer guaranteed social respect. So, society invented a new gatekeeper: etiquette. The language of refinement became the passport into high society, and everyone was scrambling to conjugate properly. The word polite itself took on a revolutionary meaning. Before the 18th century, it meant smooth or polished, as in a polished surface. Now it meant socially smooth, someone who could glide through conversation without friction, never offending, never sweating, never visibly existing too much. The goal wasn't to be authentic, it was to be agreeable. Politeness was the social equivalent of wax fruit, attractive, flawless, and completely inedible. London became the epicenter of this movement, the polished heart of polite behaviour. Urban life offered endless opportunities for friction, crowds, commerce, and class collisions. So politeness acted like social oil, keeping everyone's gears turning smoothly. The city's new coffee houses, assembly rooms, and clubs were temples of civility, where people could mingle across class boundaries, but only if they played by the rules. No shouting, no vulgar jokes, no politics over pastry. One wrong remark and you weren't just rude, you were philosophically unsound. Writers and intellectuals turned this obsession into a kind of secular religion. Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's Spectator essays painted the ideal polite gentleman as thoughtful, well-read, and emotionally balanced, a man who could discuss Milton one moment and fashion the next. This new cultural hero wasn't born noble, he was self-made through manners. It was the first draft of the modern self-improvement movement, just with more lace cuffs. But while politeness was supposed to unite people, it mostly turned them into performance artists. Everyone was trying to out-polite everyone else. The goal wasn't to be kind, so it was to be admired for being kind in the most tasteful way possible. And naturally, that kind of moral competition leads to disaster. Picture a dinner party where everyone's trying to look humble about how polite they are. Oh, please. You first. No, I insist, you first. I couldn't possibly. And there they are, starving to death at the door, buried under a mountain of mutual civility. Politeness also became gendered theatre. Men performed moderation and self-control, the rational mind ruling over passion. Women, meanwhile, were tasked with embodying grace and delicacy. Their politeness meant to flatter, soothe, and never contradict. Society turned them into walking mirrors reflecting everyone else's virtue. A Georgian lady was expected to charm without speaking too much, smile without showing teeth, and faint only in an aesthetically pleasing direction. And while the upper classes were busy curating perfection, the middle classes were paying tutors to teach them how to imitate it. Dancing masters, elocution coaches, and deportment experts became the influencers of their day. The polite education industry exploded, promising to transform the merchants' daughters into duchesses and clerks into conversationalists. Politeness became an economy in itself, the original fake it till you make it. But there was a dark side to all this refinement. The new social order demanded constant self-surveillance. Being polite meant never forgetting your audience, never letting your instincts run wild. Laughter had to be subdued, anger concealed, and opinions carefully sanded down to the most inoffensive possible shape. Authenticity was treated like a contagious disease. The result was a society full of people smiling, nodding, and privately fantasizing about smashing teacups. And yet this strange obsession worked. Politeness became Britain's brand. It separated the civilized from the savage, the refined from the rude. It was even touted as a mark of national superiority. Britain's calm restraint contrasted with the emotional excess of those continental types. Even the empire adopted the performance. Conquer politely, rule gently, and write thank you notes on stationery embossed with moral virtue. What began as a philosophical ideal had turned into a fashion trend, but one with lasting consequences. The polite society taught Britain how to mask inequality with grace, how to disguise competition as civility, and how to maintain control through charm. The people who mastered this art rose fast. Those who didn't were quietly erased, not rudely of course, just politely ignored until they ceased to exist. By the century's end, politeness was no longer just behaviour, it was an identity. To be British meant to be polite, composed, and mildly uncomfortable at all times. Beneath the powdered calm, though, was a nation addicted to appearances, one that confused manners for morality and conversation for connection. In Georgian Britain, manners didn't just smooth social life, they weaponized it. The entire country ran on an invisible battlefield where bows, handshakes, and compliments were ammunition. Politeness wasn't about kindness, it was about control. Every "my dear sir" could be loaded with malice, every curtsy could contain a coded insult. Your handshake wasn't friendly, it was a duel fought at wrist level. This was an age when power depended not just on money or birth, but on the performance of refinement. If the previous century had knights with swords, the 18th century had gentlemen with gestures. A slight too cold, a bow too shallow, a smile too delayed. These were the social equivalent of firing a cannon. Everyone knew it too. A true Georgian gentleman could cut a rival to pieces without raising his voice above a murmur or spilling a single drop of tea. Society's elite understood that in a world obsessed with appearances, dominance had to look elegant. The duel wasn't over when the pistols were holstered. It continued at the dinner table. You didn't shout your superiority, you performed it. The nobility's version of combat took place through conversation, introductions, and calculated indifference. To ignore someone was not mere rudeness, it was strategic annihilation. Take, for example, the subtle hierarchy of greetings. When two men met, the order of bowing revealed their rank. The inferior bowed first, the superior responded slightly less deeply. Both were expected to pretend it was a friendly exchange, though everyone watching understood exactly who had won. It was fencing in slow motion, choreographed and deadly. In a Georgian ballroom, hundreds of these silent duels played out nightly, each one determining who would rise and who would quietly vanish from next week's invitation list. Politeness manuals from the era even provided instructions for these social confrontations. They taught when to acknowledge someone, when to feign distraction, and how to express contempt with grace. One 18th century guide advised, "A gentleman must learn to wound without offence," which, translated from Georgian, means make them cry but make it look like their fault. At court the stakes were even higher. The royal drawing rooms were arenas of subtle humiliation. Courtiers spent hours perfecting bows to the king, each one a performance of loyalty, but within those same movements were hidden rivalries. If your knee bent too quickly, you looked servile. Too slowly, you appeared arrogant. One misjudged angle could destroy a career. Imagine trying to keep your balance in silk shoes while your entire reputation depended on the geometry of your spine. For women, the battlefield was conversation. Polite ladies wielded gossip like scalpels, slicing through reputations under the guise of idle chatter. "Oh, I do so admire Lady Pembroke's courage, wearing that colour in her condition. That's not small talk, that's a social execution." Drawing rooms became arenas where smiles masked bloodsport, and every compliment came with an aftertaste of poison. It wasn't just the upper crust either. The middle class, desperate to imitate the elite, turned this art of polite aggression into a national pastime. They practiced the fine art of civil correction, gently pointing out another's faux pas while pretending to be helpful. "I'm sure you didn't mean to use that fork for fish." Translated, "You've just disqualified yourself from human society." This kind of warfare was exhausting, but it kept the social machinery running. Politeness allowed people to attack without appearing cruel and defend themselves without losing composure. A perfectly timed laugh, a well-placed silence, a raised eyebrow, these became the tools of dominance. The more subtle you were, the deadlier your skill. If your opponent left the room smiling but later realized they'd been insulted, congratulations, you'd won the round. Even correspondence became part of this elegant combat. Letters were laced with double meanings and passive-aggressive phrasing. The closing "your most obedient servant" could mean genuine respect, or that you hoped the recipient tripped over their own sense of superiority. The phrase "with all due respect" was practically an 18th century battle cry. The ballroom too was a battlefield, but one disguised as beauty. Dance was not just entertainment, it was politics set to music. Who you partnered with, how long you danced, and even how gracefully you moved reflected your alliances. Refuse a dance and you risked insulting a family. Accept too many and you risk scandal. Every step was a negotiation, every smile a declaration of intent. And then came the art of the insult disguised as civility, a Georgian specialty. If you wanted to devastate someone, you didn't shout. You smiled and said, "Ah, your portrait captures you exactly." Or, "You've grown so comfortable in your stuff." In a society obsessed with appearances, a compliment could be the sharpest weapon of all. Even friendship wasn't safe. The language of politeness demanded constant performance, so no one knew where sincerity ended and strategy began. One could never tell if affection was genuine or just another form of social insurance. The result was a world full of smiles with teeth behind them. This system of weaponized manners might sound absurd, and it was, but it worked. It kept society stable, predictable, and exquisitely tense. Nobody wanted open conflict when they could destroy each other with tone and timing instead. Georgian politeness was the original psychological warfare, and it required nerves of steel wrapped in lace. By the end of the century, being well-bred didn't just mean possessing refinement, it meant surviving this constant silent combat without bleeding in public. Every bow, smile, and greeting was a move in a game that no one could ever stop playing. The good news, you could climb the social ladder with enough grace and strategy. The bad news, you'd lose your soul somewhere between the second bow and the third curtsy. Welcome to the Georgian coffee house, the nerve centre of the age of politeness, and arguably the most caffeinated battlefield in British history. These weren't cosy spots to sip a quiet latte. They were arenas of wit, gossip and verbal swordplay where men proved their refinement through debate. Nothing says refinement like arguing about philosophy while shaking from your fifth espresso. By the early 18th century, London was boiling, quite literally, with caffeine. Coffeehouses sprouted on nearly every corner, each one smelling faintly of roasted beans, ink and ego. They were nicknamed penny universities because entry cost a single penny. Cheap tuition for an education in politics, philosophy, scandal and sarcasm. Inside you could find writers, merchants, politicians and gentlemen elbow to elbow, all pretending to be equals for the price of a cup. But make no mistake, this wasn't democracy. It was civilized competition in disguise. Politeness demanded that men disagree gracefully, which only made them more dangerous. They didn't duel with swords, they fenced with sentences. The coffee house was the stage, and every man wanted the last word, preferably delivered with enough flair to draw applause but not enough passion to seem vulgar. Imagine the scene. Wigs powdered, cups clinking, a haze of tobacco smoke, and 20 men gesturing dramatically with spoons. One quotes Locke, another interrupts with Addison, and someone in the back misquotes both loudly. The waiter weaves through like a veteran diplomat, dodging arguments about liberty, trade, and the moral decline of youth, who were apparently already declining even then. Conversation was currency, and everyone wanted to sound like they'd read something. Topics range from new scientific discoveries to parliamentary gossip to the moral question of whether wigs should be taxed. They were to widespread outrage. But there were rules, unwritten of course, but brutally enforced. You could express an opinion, but not too strongly. You could correct someone, but only with an air of regret. And you could insult someone's intellect, but only if you smiled while doing it. Politeness in coffee houses was a high-wire act. The ideal participant balanced reason with charm, passion with moderation. If you got too emotional, you were unmannerly, too detached, and you were pretentious. The perfect debater made it seem as though ideas floated gently from his mouth, unbothered by the heat of argument or the caffeine coursing through his veins. Georgian Britain's obsession with self-control met its greatest challenge here. Men discussing theology after midnight with trembling hands and blood pressure that could power a textile mill. Each coffee house developed its own personality. Will's Coffee House, for instance, was the haunt of literary men, the Starbucks of satire, where writers like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift perfected the art of the cutting remark. Button's Coffee House was home to essayists and philosophers. Lloyd's catered to businessmen and ship owners. It would eventually become Lloyd's of London. Some houses even had their own newspapers, scribbled on site and passed around for comment, each one filled with scandal, wit, and at least one argument about whether the French were overdoing it again. The coffee house was also a laboratory for a new kind of masculinity, the polite gentleman. He didn't shout, swagger or duel. He discussed. His weapon was logic. His armour, civility. To be seen shouting in public was social suicide. Instead, you learned to destroy a man's argument slowly, like peeling an orange, one careful remark at a time. If your opponent left thinking he'd won until an hour later when your wit sank in, you'd achieved mastery. But despite the polished tone, these spaces were anything but peaceful. They buzzed with tension, class tension, political tension, and perhaps most of all, caffeine tension. The supposedly egalitarian nature of the coffee house was a polite fiction. Gentlemen might sip alongside merchants, but the hierarchy still seeped through. The language of refinement made sure of it. Those who spoke with too much accent, dressed with too little lace, or gestured too enthusiastically were gently frozen out of the conversation. It wasn't exclusion by law. It was exclusion by eyebrow. Still, the coffee house did something extraordinary. It democratized discourse. For the first time, men outside the aristocracy could shape public opinion, if they were clever enough. Ideas that started in these smoky rooms spread through pamphlets, newspapers, and satire. The Enlightenment didn't happen in marble halls. It happened over sticky tables between arguments about the national debt and whether milk ruined the purity of coffee. And then there was the gossip. For all the talk of philosophy, the real fuel of the coffee house was rumour. Political intrigue, love affairs, stock tips, everything circulated faster than the coffee itself. News networks formed through word of mouth, creating what some historians call the first information society. If you wanted to know anything in Georgian Britain, from royal scandals to the latest duel, you didn't read it first. You heard it first, between sips. But perhaps the most telling thing about the coffee house was its tone. No matter how heated the argument, everyone maintained the performance of politeness. You could disagree passionately, but you had to look like you were enjoying it. If someone insulted your ideas, you laughed. If someone questioned your honour, you offered them another drink. In the Georgian mind, reason and civility weren't just virtues, they were proof of superiority. Losing your temper meant losing your class. By the end of the century, coffee houses had changed British culture forever. They gave birth to journalism, business networks, and public debate, but they also cemented the idea that intellect must always wear a mask of manners. In these smoky, jittery rooms, the Georgian elite perfected their greatest trick, turning conversation into competition while pretending it was friendship. The good news, Britain had learned how to discuss ideas without bloodshed. The bad news, it replaced violence with condescension, which, depending on your table mates, was sometimes worse. If the coffee house was the arena of male wit and caffeine-fueled philosophy, the tea table was its elegant mirror, a battlefield wrapped in lace and porcelain. Here women ruled, and social combat was waged with teaspoons instead of pistols. The tea table looked dainty, but it could destroy reputations faster than a royal scandal. You didn't spill tea, you were the tea. By the mid-18th century, tea drinking had become the defining ritual of polite domestic life. Imported from China and scandalously expensive at first, tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a statement. Owning tea signified refinement. Hosting a tea table proved mastery of the new art of female civility. The hostess wasn't merely serving a drink, she was demonstrating her household's virtue, her husband's wealth, and her own ability to make conversation sound effortless, which, in Georgian terms, was Olympic-level multitasking. Tea drinking offered women something radical for the era: authority within the home. In public, men dominated debate and politics, but in the parlour, power shifted. The lady of the house decided who sat, who poured, and who never got invited back. Every aspect of the ceremony, from the choice of porcelain to the curve of the curtsy, projected social intelligence. Even the teapot had politics. A Chinese pot said, "I have taste." A local imitation said, "I'm patriotic." A silver teapot said, "My husband's investments haven't collapsed. Yet." But beneath the clink of cups lay a dangerous game. The tea table was a polite surveillance network. Conversation here wasn't idle, it was reconnaissance. Women traded news, judged reputations, and conducted social diplomacy under the soothing steam of Earl Grey. Compliments were currency, gossip was gold. To be invited to tea was an honour. To leave without being talked about was a miracle. Politeness demanded that everything be subtle. Outright malice was gauche. Instead, insults were wrapped in sugar. A hostess might say, "My dear, how brave you are to wear that colour," which translated roughly to, "I can't believe you left the house looking like that." The ability to devastate without raising your voice became a feminine art form. No swords, no duels, just weaponized niceness. The ritual itself reinforced hierarchy. The seating arrangement spoke volumes. Important guests sat near the hostess. Lesser mortals perched on the edge of a sofa, praying not to drop crumbs. Passing the sugar bowl was more than a gesture, it was an acknowledgement of status. Decline to pour for someone of higher rank, and your reputation would evaporate faster than the steam. The Georgian tea table was like an 18th century social media feed. Everyone curated their image, and everyone was watching everyone else for mistakes. And those mistakes could be catastrophic. There were rules, so many rules, about pouring, stirring, sipping and serving. Stir too vigorously and you looked unrefined. Slurp and you might as well have barked. Bite your biscuit at the wrong time and someone across the table would already be composing a letter about your disturbing lack of gentility. Manuals appeared to guide terrified hostesses through this minefield. One advised that the teacup must be held between thumb and forefinger, with the wrist low and serene. Because nothing said civilized like controlling your wrist angle under pressure. Tea drinking also reshaped gender expectations. The male world valued reason and restraint. The female sphere valued grace and gentility. Women were expected to embody calm, delicate, moral, and ever-pleasant. A lady's politeness was her armour, but it was also her cage. She couldn't speak too loudly, laugh too freely, or express too much intelligence without risking whispers. Tea gatherings were therefore double-edged. They gave women influence but demanded constant self-control. Every smile was strategic, every laugh rehearsed. Still, within those constraints, women wielded immense soft power. The tea table became the hub of social networking. Matches were made, alliances forged, scandals managed, all over pastries. Invitations to the right tea gatherings could elevate a family's standing, while exclusion signalled social death. To be cut from a hostess's guest list was as ruinous as being exiled to Siberia, only with less fur and more embroidery. The obsession extended to material culture. Fine porcelain became an obsession bordering on madness. The famous Meissen and Wedgwood sets were not just decorative, they were status manifestos. Displaying a complete matching tea service suggested impeccable taste and moral order. Having mismatched cups hinted at moral chaos, possibly treason. Collecting china became a competitive sport, one that has occasionally bankrupted families. The phrase teacup drama may be modern, but the phenomenon certainly isn't. For servants, the tea ritual was equally theatrical. They rehearsed the timing of entry, the angle of the tray, and the silence of the step. Dropping a spoon could end employment, spilling tea could end a career. Yet paradoxically, the perfection of the performance depended on their invisibility. A successful tea was one in which nothing and no one drew attention away from the illusion of serene civility. Even literature got in on the act. Novelists like Jane Austen would later immortalise the tea table as the stage of subtle warfare, where characters revealed ambition and vanity under the cover of small talk. But in the Georgian world itself, it was no parody. This was serious business disguised as pleasantry. Every pour and pause carried consequences. By the end of the 18th century, tea drinking had become a national ritual, one that blended morality, economy, and image. It taught women diplomacy, patience, and the ability to annihilate an opponent with a compliment. It also turned every afternoon into a performance. The good news, you got to control the guest list. The bad news, the moment you turned your back, your name it was probably steeping in someone else's cup. In the Georgian world, conversation wasn't just small talk. It was a competitive art form, a social dance where your words had to glide, never stumble. To speak gracefully was to live successfully. Silence was suspicious. Bluntness was barbaric. The well-bred Georgian didn't just talk, they performed conversation as if each sentence might be reviewed in tomorrow's society pages, and they weren't wrong. If you mentioned the weather twice, you were basically a social war criminal. The 18th century birthed an entire industry of etiquette manuals, conversation guides and moral essays, all warning that your mouth was your most dangerous possession. You could ruin your prospects faster by saying the wrong thing at a dinner party than by losing a small fortune at cards. So naturally, Georgians turned speech into science. Manuals offered instructions with all the seriousness of military drills, how long to hold eye contact, when to laugh, and, most crucially, how to sound intelligent without accidentally revealing your actual opinions. One popular guide advised, let your discourse be easy but not too familiar, witty but not too much so. In other words, be interesting, but never interesting enough to make others uncomfortable. Conversation wasn't about communication, it was about calibration. You had to maintain a delicate balance, lively enough to seem clever, modest enough to seem virtuous, and utterly inoffensive at all times. If someone asked your opinion, you were expected to give it in a way that pleased both the questioner and any potential eavesdropper. The truth was optional. Polite conversation wasn't spontaneous, it was choreographed. Like a minuet, it relied on rhythm, timing, and the unspoken understanding that no one really cared what you thought. The goal wasn't depth, it was smoothness. If the talk flowed, the event was a success. If there was sun, it was a catastrophe on par with a social death. A host's worst nightmare was an awkward pause long enough to hear someone's spoon clink. That wasn't just uncomfortable, it was evidence of moral decay. Topics, too, were tightly controlled. Politics, dangerous. Religion, suicidal. Money, absolutely not. The safest subjects were literature, travel, fashion, and mild philosophical musings, discussed, of course, in the correct tone of detached amusement. The weather was acceptable once as a polite opener. Mention it twice, and you might as well confess you were raised in a barn. Conversation circles often included both men and women, but with different expectations. Men were supposed to demonstrate intelligence and wit, quoting poets or philosophers with casual ease. Women, meanwhile, were expected to display grace and attentiveness, speaking just enough to seem charming, but never so much as to seem learned. It was a tightrope act performed in silk shoes. A woman who talked too much was forward, one who talked too little was dull, and heaven forbid she corrected a man's Latin. But the great conversationalists were celebrities. Figures like Samuel Johnson, Edmund Burke, and David Garrick were renowned not only for their ideas, but for how they expressed them. Their talk was lively, unpredictable, and dazzlingly articulate, but always within the bounds of decorum. A well-timed pun could make you the toast of the evening. A clumsy one could exile you from future gatherings. Georgian London was, in essence, a talk show that never ended. The skill of listening became equally important, or at least pretending to. Manuals advised nodding at appropriate intervals, offering murmured agreement and occasionally interjecting, indeed, with the proper level of feigned fascination. If someone launched into a dull anecdote about their cousin's gout, you smiled heroically and looked enthralled. True politeness required suffering in silence, preferably with your spine straight and your eyebrows symmetrical. Hosts and hostesses engineered these conversational performances with the precision of generals. Guests were seated strategically, witty next to dull, charming next to awkward, to ensure a steady flow of civility. The best salons were social laboratories, testing the boundaries of taste. They produced what the age called the man of conversation, a new species of social animal who could adapt to any company, charm any listener, and escape any topic that smelled of controversy. He was equal parts scholar, actor, and escape artist. But this obsession came at a cost. Genuine feeling, humour, or curiosity had to be carefully disguised. Politeness demanded that conversation never get too real. Strong opinions were indecent. Passion was chaos. The only safe emotion was amusement. Georgian society didn't want sincerity. It wanted sparkle. A person who spoke earnestly about love, grief, or ambition risked being labelled enthusiastic, which was code for unhinged. Naturally, this made the whole business exhausting. People began to dread social calls, not for lack of company, but for fear of running out of safe topics. Diaries of the period reveal the horror of conversation fatigue, that awful moment when you've exhausted talk of books, gardens, and fashion trends, and must stare at your companion praying they'll say something first. One wit complained, "I would rather duel than dine with a bore," and yet every evening the performance continued. Even letter writing absorbed this theatrical politeness. Written correspondence mirrored spoken etiquette, graceful, indirect, and endlessly self-deprecating. You couldn't just thank someone for dinner. You had to describe your unworthy delight in the company of such elevated minds, followed by 3 paragraphs of apologies for being human. Ironically, for all its rules, the age that worshipped polite conversation, also birthed some of the most cutting satire in English history. Writers like Sheridan and Swift mocked the emptiness of social speech. People who spoke beautifully but said nothing. It was the ultimate Georgian paradox. They mastered the art of communication only to make conversation meaningless. By the end of the century, Britain's cult of conversation had peaked. Those who could perform it flawlessly ruled society. Those who couldn't quietly withdrew to the countryside where they could finally speak freely. To cows. The good news, you could talk your way into any circle if you had charm, timing and nerves of steel. The bad news, you'd never be sure if anyone actually liked you or if they were just politely pretending. In Georgian Britain, how you moved mattered just as much as how you spoke. You could have perfect grammar, dazzling wit and an impeccable outfit, but if your bow was sloppy, you might as well have belched in Latin. Physical greetings weren't just gestures, they were performances of identity. Every bend of the knee, every tilt of the head, every flick of the wrist carried meaning. Stand wrong and congratulations, you've just offended the Duke of Polite Displeasure. The bow and the curtsy were the twin pillars of Georgian body language, elaborate, wordless declarations of respect, rank and self-control. In an age when everyone lived under the microscope of etiquette, they became acts of choreography that separated the refined from the ridiculous. There were no quick nods or casual handshakes here. Greeting someone of higher status was as delicate as approaching a sleeping lion. One false move, and your reputation was mauled. For men, the bow was a full-body expression of hierarchy. Manuals from the 18th century explained it in terrifying detail. The feet were to form a graceful angle. The arms must hang with natural elegance. The head incline at precisely the right degree of reverence. Too deep and you looked servile. Too shallow and you appeared arrogant. It was geometry with consequences. Bowing wasn't just about acknowledging another person. It was about acknowledging your place in the great social food chain. And of course, because this was the Georgian era, there were manuals for everything. Dance instructors and etiquette tutors filled entire volumes with diagrams of the proper inclination of the head, or the suitable curvature of the spine in mixed company. Young aristocrats practiced in front of mirrors like ballerinas, trying to achieve that perfect balance between humility and grace. A gentleman was expected to move as though his joints were made of silk, controlled, deliberate, and entirely unspontaneous. Women had it worse. The curtsy was not a greeting. It was a test of poise, strength, and occasionally gravity itself. The ideal curtsy required bending the knees while keeping the upper body perfectly straight. One hand delicately holding the skirt to display just the right amount of embroidery, enough to dazzle, not enough to scandalize. The trick was to descend smoothly, hold the pose with angelic serenity, and rise again as though lifted by divine strings. Failure meant wobbling, trembling, or, God forbid, toppling over. A disaster that could haunt your social calendar for months. It sounds absurd now, but these gestures carried real consequences. A noblewoman's curtsy at court wasn't merely polite, it was political. When presented to the monarch, one had to perform a series of curtsies of varying depths to the royal family, each calibrated to the recipient's rank. Too much enthusiasm toward a lower-ranking princess could be seen as mockery. Too little toward the queen, and you might find your invitation suddenly lost. The bow and curtsy were social mathematics, and one miscalculation could bankrupt your reputation. The theatre of greeting extended far beyond palaces. In ballrooms, assembly halls, and even the streets of Bath, people bowed and curtsied as naturally as breathing, except it wasn't natural at all. Hours of practice went into appearing effortlessly elegant. Dancers were trained from childhood to enter and leave a room with the right level of grace. Parents hired masters of deportment to ensure their children didn't stand like mortals, but these gestures were more than vanity. They embodied the Georgian obsession with self-control. Every bow said, "I have tamed my body, I am civilized." Politeness wasn't just about manners, it was about mastery. To stand correctly was to display moral order. To slouch was to suggest inner chaos. This belief ran so deep that posture itself became a moral barometer. An upright stance meant virtue. A relaxed one implied moral decay. You weren't just judged for what you did, you were judged for how gracefully you breathed while doing it. Naturally, the lower classes found this all hilarious. Satirical prints of the time mocked the aristocracy's obsession with physical refinement, depicting overdressed ladies curtsying so deeply they disappeared under their skirts, or men bowing until their wigs fell off. The cartoonists weren't wrong. The late 1700s produced a species of aristocrat whose muscles were permanently trained for politeness. One wrong movement could expose their humanity, and that simply wouldn't do. Even outside of high society, the contagion spread. The merchant classes imitated the upper crust with mixed results. A self-made businessman might execute a bow too dramatically, looking like he'd dropped something. A newly rich hostess might curtsy with so much enthusiasm that she resembled a malfunctioning puppet. Etiquette teachers made fortunes correcting these social blunders. One contemporary remarked that politeness, when misapplied, makes the vulgar appear twice as vulgar. And let's not forget the handshake, a rare form of greeting among the elite, but increasingly common among the middle class. It was meant to be simple, direct and democratic, but Georgians being Georgians, they turned it into another test of finesse. The pressure had to be firm but not forceful, the duration brief but not abrupt, and the expression on your face one of mild benevolence tinged with superiority. Too long a grip was suspiciously intimate. Too weak and you were labelled limp. Too firm and you were accused of having mercantile enthusiasm. In short, you could lose a business deal before you even sat down. All this precision created a strange paradox. The bow and curtsy were meant to express humility, yet mastering them became a form of pride. They were symbols of discipline, the visible proof that one had absorbed the invisible rules of society. To move correctly was to belong, to move incorrectly was to reveal yourself as an outsider. By the end of the century, the ritualized greeting had become second nature, a kind of social language spoken entirely in knees and vertebrae. It was beautiful to watch, absurd to live, and exhausting to maintain. The good news, everyone looked graceful. The bad news, half of them had chronic back pain from curtsying for a living. In Georgian Britain, morality didn't come from sermons. It came from your wardrobe. Clothes weren't just fabric, they were a language of virtue, wealth, and ambition, woven together with thread, silk, and hypocrisy. To dress well was to announce your moral worth to the world, because in this society the hem of your gown said more about your soul than your priest ever could. Virtue may be priceless, but silk taffeta certainly wasn't. The early 18th century brought a new obsession with decency and decorum. As politeness became the supreme social law, clothing turned into its most visible expression. Every stitch, colour and ruffle carried moral weight. Modesty was not only expected but stage. The goal was to look virtuous without looking dull, fashionable without appearing vain. In other words, you had to look effortlessly perfect while pretending you didn't care. For women, this meant walking a line thinner than a lace ribbon. Dresses were engineered for elegance, tight corsets, flowing skirts, powdered hair piled to celestial heights, all projecting control, restraint and respectability. Your gown wasn't just a dress, it was an essay on your moral fibre. To show too much ankle was scandalous. To show too little flair was tragic. Society adored balance, as long as it was expensive. Men had their own uniform of righteousness, coats of fine wool, stockings white enough to blind, and waistcoats that declared both wealth and taste. The polite gentleman didn't flaunt luxury, he suggested it. A gentleman's lace cuff might whisper refinement, but it must never scream. Overdressing was as shameful as underdressing. Georgian men were expected to look respectable, not resplendent, unless they were aristocrats, in which case resplendence was practically a duty. But this careful performance wasn't about beauty, it was about character. The idea of fashionable virtue emerged from moral philosophy. Writers like Lord Shaftesbury and Addison claimed that external grace reflected inner goodness. To appear elegant was to demonstrate that you possessed reason, moderation, and self-command. Clothing became an outward proof of inward discipline. The body was trained to obey the mind, and the outfit proved it. That's why Georgian dress was so rigid, so restrictive. Corsets, wigs, and stiff collars weren't just style. They were symbolic armour. Every button said, "I am civilized." Every carefully powdered face said, "I have conquered my instincts." The more uncomfortable you were, the more moral you appeared. If you could sit through a 5-hour dinner party in a steel corset and a 3-foot wig without fainting, congratulations, you were a paragon of virtue. The irony, of course, was delicious. Underneath all that polished restraint, society was obsessed with showing off. Fashion was the great paradox of politeness. It demanded modesty but rewarded extravagance. A virtuous lady was expected to wear muted colours, soft creams, light blues, dignified greys, but the fabric itself needed to scream expensive. Silk from Lyon, lace from Brussels, embroidery that could feed a village. A dress could look humble and still cost more than a cottage. The wealthy classes used fashion as a moral shield. Aristocrats justified luxury by claiming that refinement uplifted society. Good taste, they argued, was evidence of superior breeding. A well-tailored coat wasn't vanity, it was civic virtue. The middle classes, desperate to emulate the elite, took this logic and ran with it. They bought imported textiles, read fashion journals, and ruined themselves financially in pursuit of looking respectable. Georgian Britain became a land where morality could be measured in thread count. This obsession even influenced fabric choices. Cotton, imported from India, was considered dangerously casual for formal wear, yet irresistible for its comfort. Silk was the mark of the elite, delicate, temperamental, and ruinously expensive, while wool stood for British industry and masculine restraint. The great moral debate of the 1750s wasn't over religion or politics. It was over whether women should wear French silk or support patriotic wool. Society chose silk, then wrote essays defending its virtue. Accessories carried their own vocabulary. Gloves signalled purity and refinement. Bare hands were unthinkably indecent in public. Fans were tools of flirtation, but only in the hands of women who had mastered the art of subtlety. Jewellery was moral danger incarnate. Pearls were acceptable, chaste and ladylike, but too many diamonds suggested a personality one might describe as professionally friendly. Even shoes had rules. A virtuous woman's heels were low, Seitun, and soft, not because she needed to walk far, but because noisy footsteps were for servants. And then there was hygiene, or rather, the illusion of it. Powdered wigs and perfume replaced cleanliness. Bathing too often was seen as suspiciously vain, yet smelling unpleasant was unforgivable. The solution? A fog of floral scent and starch that could knock a canary unconscious. Georgian virtue, like Georgian fashion, was mostly a matter of surface management. Critics of the time saw the hypocrisy. Satirists like William Hogarth skewered polite society in engravings where moral decay hid behind fashionable beauty. His famous print Marriage à la Mode depicted aristocrats in fine silk and powdered wigs, refined, elegant, and utterly corrupt. The message was clear. Virtue was stitched onto people, not built inside them. But even as the satire bit deep, the trend endured. To appear moral was easier than to be moral, and Georgian society adored appearances. The polite classes would rather die in discomfort than appear inelegant, and many nearly did. Tight corsets restricted breathing, towering wigs attracted vermin, and men fainted from heat inside their brocade coats. Refinement, it turned out, was a surprisingly dangerous hobby. By the close of the century, fashion had become a kind of moral theatre, one where every outfit played a role in the grand performance of virtue. The good news? You could look like a saint. The bad news? You had to suffer like one too. In Georgian Britain, even the buildings had manners. If the people were expected to stand straight, smile politely, and never revealed too much emotion, then the architecture followed suit, symmetrical, balanced, calm, and never, ever vulgar. Streets became lectures in restraint. Doorways gave lessons in good taste. In this age of refinement, even moral bricks were expected to behave. If your windows didn't match, you were basically shouting in public. The Georgian era wasn't just a time of etiquette manuals and tea rituals, it was a full-blown aesthetic crusade. The same values that governed polite society, order, harmony, proportion, seeped into its architecture. To live in a Georgian house was to reside inside a sermon on civility. Buildings were designed to exude self-control, no flamboyant flourishes, no medieval chaos, no Gothic gloom, just perfect rational symmetry, a kind of stone embodiment of keep calm and carry on. The blueprint of politeness came from the Palladian revival, inspired by the Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. His ideas of mathematical proportion and classical simplicity captivated British designers, who saw in them a reflection of Enlightenment ideals, reason, balance, and moral clarity. The result was the Georgian townhouse, dignified, rational, and so symmetrical it could make a mirror jealous. Step into one of these homes, and you were stepping into a physical manifestation of manners. The facade was flat, composed, and perfectly aligned. Windows were evenly spaced. Doors were centered. Columns stood like well-trained soldiers. Nothing screamed for attention. Nothing leaned, bulged, or showed off. A polite house didn't try to impress. It simply was impressive. It whispered respectability the way a well-bred hostess whispered gossip. Quietly but effectively. Inside, the choreography of civility continued. Georgian interiors were lessons in order. Clean lines, balanced spaces, soft colours, and a hierarchy of rooms designed to maintain both comfort and control. The entrance hall was calm and uncluttered. The staircase grand but not boastful. Parlours were symmetrical, with furniture arranged to encourage polite conversation. There were even etiquette rules for spatial behaviour. Never linger too close to the door, it implied impatience, and never sit too far from the fire, it implied indifference. This obsession with order wasn't purely aesthetic, it was moral. The Enlightenment had convinced Britain that beauty and virtue were connected. A symmetrical building reflected a symmetrical soul. Disorder in architecture suggested disorder in life. A crooked window hinted at a crooked mind. The geometry of politeness kept everything and everyone in their proper place. Cities, too, were redesigned to look as courteous as their inhabitants aspired to be. London's chaotic medieval sprawl gave way to carefully planned squares and terraces, rows of uniform facades presenting a unified, well-mannered face to the world. The most famous of these developments, like Bloomsbury and Bath's Royal Crescent, became showcases of urban civility. They were designed to impress not through grandeur, but through collective restraint. Even the streets learned to stand in straight lines. Bath, in particular, became the architectural expression of politeness turned to stone. Its honey-coloured facades, designed by John Wood the Elder and his son, formed crescent circles and square, so perfectly symmetrical they bordered on moral preaching. Here, one could promenade surrounded by limestone decency, basking in the glow of architectural self-restraint. Bath was the city equivalent of a powdered wig, carefully arranged, expensive to maintain, and hiding centuries of chaos beneath. In the countryside, the gentry embraced the same ideals on a larger, quieter scale. Country houses like Holcombe Hall and Chiswick House reflected their owners' Enlightenment credentials. They weren't built merely for comfort or display, they were moral statements in stone. Wide columned porticos spoke of moderation. Balanced facades signalled temperance. Gardens, meticulously trimmed into geometric perfection, symbolised control over nature, proof that even the wild obeyed the polite hand of man. Yet beneath the symmetry lay anxiety. Georgian architecture was a performance, just like Georgian conversation or fashion. The exteriors projected composure, but the interiors were carefully staged to hide the mess of daily life. Behind those elegant facades were bustling kitchens, overworked servants, and sometimes crumbling walls disguised by fresh plaster. Respectability had to be maintained at all costs, even if it meant painting over the cracks every week. And then there was class. Polite architecture was exclusive by design. Townhouses in Mayfair or Bath's Crescents weren't just homes, they were symbols of belonging to the polite. To live in symmetry was to be civilized. To live outside it was to be suspect. The poor, of course, didn't have time for symmetry. Their homes were irregular, crowded and messy. Georgian society looked down on such disorder not just as poverty, but as moral failure. The neatness of one's building became a shorthand for the neatness of one's soul. The architecture even influenced behaviour. People who lived in these polite spaces were expected to move politely within them. No rushing, no slamming doors, no loud laughter echoing through the stairwells. The architecture demanded composure. You didn't merely inhabit a Georgian home, you conformed to it. A slouch looked out of place under a coffered ceiling. Loudness clashed with Palladian proportion. The walls themselves seemed to frown if you raised your voice. But there was also a certain beauty in this restraint. Georgian architecture created a sense of calm and coherence that still defines many British cities today. Its quiet dignity reflected a society obsessed with appearances, yes, but also one yearning for stability in a rapidly changing world. Beneath the powdered elegance and marble manners, there was a genuine desire for order, harmony and permanence. By the late 18th century, good architecture had become synonymous with good morals. A refined facade wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a badge of virtue. The good news, the buildings stood straight even when people didn't. The bad news, the buildings had better personalities. In Georgian Britain, dinner was never just dinner. It was an examination in etiquette, a performance of refinement where the wrong fork could ruin a family's reputation. Dining became an Olympic event of manners, with silverware as weaponry and politeness as armour. Guests didn't simply eat, they endured. Dinner wasn't eaten, it was survived. The Georgian dinner table was where civility met terror. Every evening was a test of grace under pressure, a symphony of knives, forks, and social anxiety. You were expected to glide through multiple courses without slurping, spilling, or looking hungry. The goal wasn't nourishment, it was composure. Eating in public became a moral act, an expression of restraint. A well-bred person could consume roast beef soup and pudding while giving the impression they survived solely on air and philosophy. The table itself was a stage, and its set design said everything about the host's refinement. The wealthy spared no expense. Mahogany tables gleamed under candlelight, silver glinted like weaponry, and china arrived in endless coordinated sets. Soup tureens shaped like swans, salt cellars shaped like shells, plates thin enough to snap under moral pressure, flowers, candles, and folded napkins created what one observer called a landscape of civility. Guests sat before it like nervous explorers who weren't sure which part of the scenery they were allowed to touch. Then came the rules, a labyrinth of rituals so complicated it made tax law look simple. You could not begin eating until your host lifted their fork. You could not talk with your mouth full, breathe too heavily, or acknowledge your own chewing. It was considered grotesquely human. If someone dropped a utensil, you pretended not to notice. Sympathy was vulgar. Conversation had to flow like the wine, constant, sparkling, and never too personal. The smallest misstep, a cough, a clatter, a moment of visible enjoyment, could mark you forever as unrefined. The fear began with the utensils themselves. The fork, still relatively new in England, had only recently been adopted as a symbol of sophistication. Earlier generations saw it as foreign and effeminate, but by the Georgian period it was indispensable and horrifyingly complicated. There were forks for meat, for fish, for dessert, and for fruit. To use the wrong one was to commit social suicide. Guests were expected to navigate this metallic minefield with precision. Manuals sternly advised. The knife conveys strength, The fork refinement. Use both improperly and you shall be neither. Even holding the utensils was perilous. The proper angle of the wrist could mean the difference between cultured and barbaric. The fork faced downward for meat, sideways for vegetables, and upward only when not in use. The knife, meanwhile, had to be wielded delicately, never aggressively, as if you were negotiating with your food, not conquering it. Those who cut too vigorously risked being labelled spirited, which was a polite way of saying uncivilized. And heaven help the person who confused the soup course. Soup was the great equalizer of dinner. Everyone feared it. You couldn't slurp, vulgar, blow on it, barbaric, or spill it, catastrophic. The correct method was to tilt the bowl away from you, dip the spoon sideways, and sip silently from the edge. Doing this without splashing your lace cuffs required monk-like concentration. More than one guest drowned their dignity in a bowl of consommé. Servants, too, were part of the ritual. Their movements had to be invisible, their timing perfect. A servant who reached too soon or too late could shatter the illusion of effortless refinement. Hosts demanded silence. Trays were padded, steps rehearsed. The dining room became a choreography of precision, where even those serving were bound by politeness. One wrong clang of silver, and the host's moral reputation trembled along with the pudding. Conversation, meanwhile, was its own balancing act. A good guest kept the talk light and impersonal, witty enough to entertain, mild enough to offend no one. Compliments were required, but carefully rationed. The roast is divine was acceptable. I'm starving was not. You were expected to show enthusiasm for the meal without implying you actually needed food. Appetite was the ultimate taboo. To enjoy too openly was to appear greedy. Dinner was less about eating and more about pretending you'd never seen a potato before in your life. Hosts, of course, weaponized this anxiety. A successful dinner was not about feeding guests, but about managing them. The menu became a social chessboard. Exotic dishes like turtle soup, truffles, and pineapple, a fruit so rare it could cost as much as a horse, proved your wealth and cosmopolitan taste. Guests might spend weeks gossiping about who had served pineapple and who had not. To be invited to such a dinner was a privilege. To survive it without humiliation was an achievement. For women, the pressure doubled. A hostess's entire reputation rested on her table. She had to select the right menu, arrange the seating by rank and compatibility, and maintain a serene smile while silently monitoring everything. A single overcooked dish or misplaced guest could end a season's worth of networking. A lady who could orchestrate a flawless dinner without breaking a sweat was considered the epitome of refinement. A lady who visibly sweated was not invited again. The satirists of the time had a field day. Writers like Tobias Smollett and cartoonists like Gilray mocked the absurdity of dinner decorum. Guests balancing peas on forks like acrobats, hosts lecturing servants on candle symmetry, and fashionable diners pretending not to notice that their powdered wigs occasionally fell into their soup. Yet even as people laughed, they kept playing the game. By the end of the century, dinner had become a full-scale moral performance. Eating was no longer a necessity but a statement, a proof of class, taste, and inner control. The good news? You got to attend exquisite feasts. The bad news? You couldn't taste them, breathe near them, or move too suddenly in their vicinity. In Georgian Britain, politeness looked effortless, but only because someone else was sweating to make it that way. The glittering calm of polite society rested squarely on the backs of an invisible army. Every bow, every gleaming plate, every candle that flickered just so was the work of servants who moved like ghosts through the machinery of manners. True refinement meant pretending you didn't notice the person holding your life together. The ideal Georgian household was a stage production of civility, and the servants were the backstage crew, absolutely essential but never acknowledged. Refinement was supposed to appear natural, a product of good breeding rather than hard labour. But in reality, it required constant maintenance. Dinner didn't serve itself, wigs didn't powder themselves, and no duchess ever poured her own tea. Behind every display of elegance was a servant with sore feet and a bucket of candle wax. A well-run house functioned like a machine, one powered by human exhaustion. The butler, the housekeeper, the cook, the maids, the footman, the coachman, the scullery girls, each had their role in sustaining the illusion that civility required no effort. The butler, resplendent in subdued dignity, managed the household with military precision. The housekeeper ruled the domestic quarters with quiet authority, keeping order beneath the stairs so that chaos never crept above them. The cook performed daily miracles in smoky kitchens, feeding dozens from ingredients that servants were never allowed to taste, and yet politeness demanded that all this labour remain unseen. A polite family did not acknowledge service. They glided through life as though their shoes cleaned themselves. When guests arrived, servants had to vanish into the wallpaper. They moved silently through rooms, trained to appear only at the exact moment they were needed, not a second sooner, and definitely not with opinions. One wrong footstep, one clink of silver, and a servant could destroy the illusion of effortless gentility. This invisibility was both professional and moral. Polite culture insisted that refined people did not speak of servitude. To mention the labour behind comfort was considered crude, even embarrassing. The best servants were those you never had to see. They appeared only when summoned, retreated before they breathed too loudly, and somehow made the entire household run as if propelled by divine will. Politeness thrived on denial, the denial that your refinement depended on someone else's exhaustion. Servants lived and worked in the shadows of elegance. Their quarters were cramped, cold and hidden from view, often tucked beneath grand staircases or at the top of draughty attics. A visitor to a Georgian townhouse might marvel at the spotless drawing room without realizing that a maid had been awake since dawn, scrubbing soot from the fireplace. Servants rose before their employers, stirred and collapsed long after they retired. To maintain the serenity of the polite world, someone else had to live without rest, privacy, or recognition. The divide between above stairs and below stairs was absolute. The master's calm was built on the servant's silence. Communication between the two worlds was conducted through bells, a system of discreet tyranny. A polite household boasted an elaborate network of bell pulls that summoned servants instantly. Each chime corresponded to a different room, and woe to the maid who didn't recognize her tone. The bell was both lifeline and leash. It allowed the gentry to command without raising their voices, and it reminded everyone who truly had control. The irony, of course, was that servants often knew their employers far better than their employers knew them. They overheard conversations or scandals unfold and managed the daily realities their masters pretended didn't exist. A good butler knew which guest to flatter, which secrets to guard, and which family arguments to pretend hadn't happened. In many cases, servants were the glue that held polite households together. But politeness demanded that they be treated as furniture with their opinions best unspoken. The culture of refinement created strange contradictions. Gentlemen prided themselves on moral virtue, yet routinely ignored the people cleaning their shoes. Ladies hosted tea parties to discuss grace and kindness, while scolding their maids for wrinkling the napkins. Servants were expected to embody politeness, courteous, tidy, deferential, but never receive it in return. Saying thank you to a servant was considered improper. After all, gratitude suggested equality, and equality was dangerously impolite. Despite this hierarchy, the relationship between servant and master was a delicate performance. A truly refined household required good servants, those who understood the nuances of politeness so thoroughly that they could uphold it even when their employers failed. A butler could rescue a social disaster by refilling glasses at just the right moment. A lady's maid might save her mistress from ruin by fixing a broken gown mid-banquet. Servants were the silent editors of their employers' reputations, endlessly polishing away the imperfections of human life. The unspoken truth was that refinement was exhausting not only for those who performed it, but for those who sustained it. To be a servant in a polite household meant constant self-erasure. You were required to exist but never be seen, to anticipate needs that were never voiced, and to accept invisibility as virtue. Even the language of employment disguised reality. Servants were described as faithful, useful, or attentive, but never human. Satirists of the time noticed the hypocrisy. Writers like Jonathan Swift and cartoonists like James Gilray skewered polite society for its dependency on invisible labour. In one famous print, powdered nobleman reclines at dinner, while servants bustle frantically behind a curtain labelled "Order and Decorum." The joke was painfully clear. The calm surface of civilization rested on chaos below. Yet the system persisted because it worked for those at the top. The appearance of effortless grace required endless unseen effort. Georgian politeness, for all its elegance, was a mask held in place by hundreds of tired hands. By the end of the century, industrial wealth would swell the servant class even further, turning invisible labour into the foundation of British respectability. The good news, the elite looked flawless. The bad news, someone else had to wake up at 4 a.m. to make sure they did. In Georgian Britain, letter writing wasn't merely communication, it was performance art. The ink wasn't there to express emotions, it was there to disguise them. Entire friendships, feuds and flirtations unfolded across parchment that said as little as possible in the most elegant way imaginable. Writing a letter was like dancing in a minefield. One false phrase and you could offend a duchess, doom a courtship, or accidentally propose marriage. You could spend 3 pages thanking someone for a dinner you didn't enjoy. The explosion of literacy, cheap postage, and moral anxiety turned correspondence into the defining social art of the 18th century. The printing press had brought people news, the quill pen brought them judgment. Everyone from philosophers to debutantes was suddenly expected to write beautifully. Not beautifully in content, of course, but in tone. The goal was refinement, not revelation. The perfect letter was one that conveyed everything polite and nothing personal. Politeness demanded structure. A proper Georgian letter had a skeleton. Salutation, compliment, reason for writing, apology for taking up time, and an elegantly unnecessary closing. Each part was a miniature performance. You never began bluntly with "Dear Sir." You began with "My most esteemed friend, whose last letter delighted my heart and improved my mind beyond measure." You didn't end with "Yours sincerely." You ended with "I remain, with the utmost admiration and devotion, your most obedient and humble servant." Every phrase was a curtsy in ink. Etiquette manuals gave strict instructions on how to craft these delicate epistles. The complete letter writer and elegant epistolary instructor offered hundreds of examples for every possible scenario. Condolences, congratulations, rejections, invitations, apologies, and declarations of mild enthusiasm. Need to politely decline a marriage proposal? There was a template for that. Need to borrow money without admitting it? Also a template. Need to end a friendship while sounding like you were improving their soul? Template 3, paragraph 2. The Georgian letter writer didn't write so much as assemble politeness by formula. But while men wrote letters to do business, women wrote letters to survive socially. For many Georgian women, correspondence was one of the few respectable outlets for intellect and wit. A lady's reputation could rise or fall by her pen. Too short a letter, and you were cold. Too long, and you were desperate. Too flowery, and you were insincere. Too plain, and you were uncultured. There were unspoken rules about handwriting, too. A neat, flowing script meant grace and education. Uneven lettering suggested low breeding or, worse, passion. And passion, of course, was the enemy of politeness. A letter that revealed genuine feeling was considered dangerous. Emotions had to be wrapped in etiquette like fragile porcelain. "I am always gratified by your correspondence" might secretly mean, "I think about you constantly and it's ruining my life." But good manners demanded restraint. Entire romances were written in code, disguised as discussions of weather and health. Georgian love letters could sound like meteorological reports. "The sun was bright today, though my spirits were low." Translation: "I'm in agony and you know it." Apologies were another art form. To say "I'm sorry" outright was too crude. Instead, writers expressed regret through elaborate compliments. "I fear I have trespassed upon your goodness," or "Pray forgive the impertinence of my quill." Even small offences like forgetting to respond or required a full page of repentance. A true apology might take longer to compose than the original insult. And then there were thank you letters, the backbone of Georgian correspondence. Every dinner, dance, or polite interaction triggered a flurry of gratitude. A single evening of cards could generate a week's worth of letters. Your hospitality was beyond all description, one might write, carefully ignoring the fact that the fish was overcooked and the wine dreadful. The sincerity of a Georgian thank you letter was directly proportional to how little the writer had enjoyed the event. Letter writing was also a test of patience. Ink smudged, paper was expensive, and quills broke constantly. Each missive was a slow-motion ordeal. There were no drafts, just prayer and parchment. A blot of ink could ruin hours of work, forcing the writer to begin anew with renewed humility. Postage wasn't cheap either. You paid by the sheet, which led to a strange paradox. Letters filled with florid padding and moral philosophy, yet written in tiny handwriting to save money. Still, the post itself became a lifeline of the polite world. The Georgian postal system was the social internet of its day, overworked, unreliable, but impossible to live without. Coaches carried thousands of letters between London and Bath from lovers, bankers, and the eternally offended. Postboys were the silent couriers of civilization, delivering heartbreak and invitations with equal discretion. The sight of a sealed envelope on your doorstep could bring joy, dread, or a new scandal to discuss over tea. The art of letter writing also bred an obsession with presentation. Wax seals were miniature works of identity, stamped with family crests or sentimental emblems. To break a seal was to enter someone's private world, or their carefully curated performance of one. Paper choice mattered too, thick for men of means, scented for women of taste, and cheap for everyone else. One could practically smell class differences through stationery. But beneath all this civility lurked exhaustion, the endless obligation to write, to reply, to flatter, and to conceal one's real thoughts turned correspondence into a kind of genteel torment. Diaries from the time complain of letter fatigue, the horror of realizing that every acquaintance expected a reply, even if they'd written only to say they had nothing to say. It was a world where silence was rude, but honesty was worse. By the late 18th century, entire relationships existed solely on paper. People courted, quarrelled, forgave, and even proposed marriage without ever saying a word aloud. The pen replaced the voice, and politeness replaced sincerity. The good news, you could sound brilliant, eloquent, and morally perfect from the safety of your writing desk, and the bad news, you could also die waiting for a reply that began with, "My most esteemed friend," and ended with absolutely nothing. By the mid-18th century, Britain had turned refinement into capitalism. What began as a moral ideal, the pursuit of grace, eloquence, and civility, became a full-blown industry. Politeness wasn't just practiced, it was purchased. You could literally buy your way into good manners for a price. Tutors, dancing masters, elocution coaches, and posture correctors flooded the cities, all promising to transform clumsy mortals into paragons of social perfection. Every bad posture was another man's business opportunity. The polite world had created its own demand, and the middle class, desperate to rise, became its most devoted customers. With the aristocracy still setting the tone of refinement, everyone else scrambled to imitate it. The result was an explosion of professions dedicated to teaching people how to stand, talk, move, smile, and even breathe in a socially acceptable way. You weren't born a gentleman or a lady anymore, you trained to become one. London, Bath, and Edinburgh became epicentres of this new civility economy. Georgian cities were crowded with advertisements for schools of polite education, masters of deportment, and finishing instructors. They offered to refine the rough, civilise the ambitious, and polish anyone who could pay. Manners were no longer inherited through birthright, they were a subscription service. The dancing master was the crown jewel of this enterprise. Dance wasn't just recreation, it was a test of grace, posture, and moral control. Every step was a metaphor for discipline, every bow a declaration of rank. Families hired instructors to teach children the intricate minuets and cotillions that dominated social events. A young man who couldn't dance was considered hopeless. A young woman who couldn't curtsy rhythmically was practically unmarriageable. Dancing masters became celebrities, equal parts fitness trainer, therapist, and drill sergeant. They corrected slouching, refined gestures and barked at pupils who dared to show enthusiasm. Then came the elocution teachers. The Georgian obsession with polite conversation had birthed a parallel obsession with how it sounded. The wrong accent could betray your class faster than a bad suit. Manuals of the period warned that harsh provincial tones marked a person as common, no matter how elegant their manners. Enter the elocution coach and the 18th century answer to the speech therapist, or drama instructor and motivational guru combined. They promised to soften vowels, smooth consonants, and replace regional inflections with the dulcet tones of upper-class speech. Polite pronunciation was linguistic camouflage. You could be from anywhere, as long as you sounded like you came from somewhere expensive. But the industry didn't stop at speech and dance. Deportment instructors sprang up to perfect the body itself. These human measuring sticks specialized in posture, teaching men how to bow without wobbling, and women how to walk without appearing to exist too loudly. They corrected gait, stance, and even the angle of the chin. A lady's head, one manual advised, should incline as though she listens to heaven. One imagines that heaven, in this case, was also charging tuition. Fashion advisors also joined the fray, guiding clients through the minefield of moralized clothing. They ensured no gentleman wore last season's cut or that a lady's ribbons didn't clash with her virtue. Tailors, wig makers, and perfumers marketed themselves not as artisans, but as guardians of grace. A well-tailored coat was said to announce good breeding, while an ill-fitting one could invite social catastrophe. Vanity was no longer sin, it was an investment portfolio. And then there were the finishing schools, institutions designed to turn young people, especially women, into walking embodiments of politeness. These schools taught French, music, embroidery, and above all, restraint. Girls learned how to converse without opining, how to smile without revealing teeth, and how to faint attractively if overwhelmed by either emotional corset pressure. Boys, meanwhile, learned fencing, rhetoric, and how to compliment a lady without sounding like they meant it. The politeness industry was also fueled by print culture. Manuals, pamphlets, and guides flooded the market. The Polite Gentleman's Companion, The Lady's Guide to Grace, and Rules for Refinement and Rational Amusement filled bookshop windows. Each one promised moral salvation through etiquette. Some sold over 10,000 copies, proof that half of Britain was terrified of being uncivilized. These books were the self-help bestsellers of their day, offering step-by-step guides to avoiding social death. And it was profitable, extremely profitable. The middle class spent fortunes chasing the illusion of innate gentility. Georgian London was full of stories about bankrupt merchants whose fortunes dissolved in the pursuit of good manners. Etiquette was not just a cultural value, it was a commodity. If you didn't have land or title, you could still buy civility by the hour. The politeness industry was the great equalizer, or at least it pretended to be. Of course, the upper classes mocked this frantic mimicry, even as they benefited from it. Aristocrats sneered at new money, trying to buy refinement, but they were the ones selling the rules. Satirists like Henry Fielding and William Hogarth ridiculed the absurdity of the self-improvement craze, painting images of men balancing books on their heads or women fainting from the sheer weight of poise. The joke, however, never stopped the demand. Politeness was addictive, and the fear of being gauche kept the cash flowing. By the late 18th century, the etiquette economy had become as essential as the fashion or print trades. Britain had industrialised not only textiles and trade, but behaviour itself. Every aspect of politeness, how to walk, talk, write, and even breathe, had been monetized. Civility had gone corporate. The good news, you could become refined with enough lessons, books, and bills. The bad news, the more people learned the rules, the more rules there seemed to be. The industry thrived on insecurity. The polite person was never finished, only in constant need of improvement. If Georgian Britain had a mortal enemy, it wasn't crime, war, or even France. It was vulgarity. No one knew exactly what it was, but everyone lived in terror of committing it. Vulgarity was the social plague of the age, invisible, contagious, and career-ending. A single misstep, too much enthusiasm, too bright a ribbon, a laugh too loud, and you were finished. Blinking too loudly could end your social career. To be vulgar was to try too hard, and in a society built on appearances, that was the greatest crime imaginable. Refinement had to look effortless. You could be rich, fashionable, or witty, but if anyone noticed you were trying, you'd instantly tumble from grace. Vulgarity was defined not by wealth or background, but by visible desire for attention, comfort, or pleasure. In other words, you were only truly elegant if you looked like you didn't care whether anyone noticed. The upper classes used this concept like a weapon. Vulgarity was their invisible fence, a way to keep newcomers, merchants, and ambitious climbers in their place. No matter how well the middle class imitated the elite, they could always be accused of vulgar striving. Buy the wrong gown, over-decorate your home, show too much delight at a compliment, and suddenly you weren't refined, you were vulgar. It was the ultimate moving target, a social game no one could win unless they'd been born with a title and a poker face. The fear of vulgarity seeped into every aspect of Georgian life. Conversation, for instance, had to be measured, never too lively. Wit was welcome, laughter was dangerous. If you laughed too loudly, you were vulgar. If you didn't laugh enough, you were cold. The trick was to emit the kind of polite chuckle that suggested both amusement and restraint, ideally at something only half funny. To express actual joy, passion, or outrage was to risk being mistaken for someone who read novels for pleasure. The same logic applied to fashion. One could wear finery, of course, but only in moderation. A lady draped in too many jewels, or a gentleman with a waistcoat too ornate, risked the dreaded label. The upper crust perfected the art of subdued luxury, fabrics rich enough to ruin you financially, yet so tastefully muted that only other rich people could tell. It was the visual equivalent of whispering about your fortune while everyone else shouted theirs. Even furniture wasn't safe from suspicion. Home decor reflected the owner's inner character, and one garish lamp could reveal a vulgar soul. Rooms had to be symmetrical, colour-coordinated, and emotionally neutral. Too many mirrors suggested vanity. Too few implied poverty. A true Georgian host wanted guests to feel impressed, but never overwhelmed. The worst possible reaction to your house was delight, because delight was for people with feelings, and feelings were vulgar. The word itself, vulgar, came from the Latin vulgus, meaning the common people. It was literally a tool of class separation, a linguistic moat between us and them. To be polite was to be above the vulgar. To be vulgar was to be hopelessly human. The upper classes used it to define taste as morality. Refinement was proof of virtue, vulgarity proof of inner corruption. A loud laugh might not be a crime, but it certainly felt sinful. For women, the rules were even crueler. The vulgar woman became the moral bogeyman of Georgian literature, the cautionary tale for all aspiring ladies. She was too talkative, too fashionable, too flirtatious, too visible. Even intelligence could be vulgar if expressed with enthusiasm. The ideal woman was quiet, graceful, and modest. She embodied politeness without drawing attention to it. To have opinions was risky. To have a personality was social suicide. Men weren't immune either. The vulgar man was usually rich and loud, a merchant or industrialist who flaunted success without knowing the proper codes of restraint. He dressed expensively but without subtlety, bragged about profits, and gestured too much. To the old aristocracy, these nouveau riches were walking embodiments of vulgarity. Proof that money couldn't buy breeding, though it could certainly rent embarrassment. This obsession with avoiding vulgarity produced a national culture of repression. People became experts at pretending. They hid excitement under smiles, ambition under modesty, and desire under etiquette. Even the way one stood was policed. Slouching was vulgar, fidgeting was vulgar, leaning too far forward while listening was desperately vulgar. The only safe posture was mild boredom. The Georgian press fanned the flames. Magazines like The World and The Connoisseur published essays ridiculing vulgar behaviour, on the horror of loud colours, on the impropriety of excessive cheerfulness, and other masterclasses in delicate judgment. Readers devoured them like rulebooks for survival. Satirical prints by artists like James Gilray mocked social climbers trying too hard, depicting women buried under feathers and men suffocating in brocade. Everyone laughed, nervously checking their own outfits afterward. The cruelty of it all was that vulgarity was undefinable. What was tasteful one year became tacky the next. The very act of imitating refinement could turn it vulgar. The middle class perfected this vicious cycle as soon as they mastered one standard of elegance. The elite invented another. Georgian politeness wasn't about sincerity. It was about staying ahead of shame. And yet, there was a perverse comfort in the fear. Vulgarity gave everyone a moral compass. However warped, it kept society in line. People learned to control themselves, their expressions, their speech, even their laughter. It was social self-discipline masquerading as taste. And while it bred hypocrisy, it also bred a kind of harmony, the calm of a world where no one dared be authentic. By the close of the century, Britain's obsession with not being vulgar had hardened into national character. The famous British Reserve, that stoic, slightly awkward politeness still joked about today, was born from centuries of social terror. The good news, the Georgians achieved the ultimate self-control. The bad news, they had to suppress half their humanity to do it. By the mid-Georgian era, the drawing rooms of Britain had become laboratories of class performance. The upper classes set the rules of refinement, but it was the middle class who studied, sweated, and sometimes bankrupted themselves trying to follow them. Manners weren't just about civility anymore. They were camouflage. Politeness became a tool for survival in a society obsessed with appearances. Everyone was pretending to be richer, calmer, and more porcelain than they were. The Industrial Revolution was quietly reshaping Britain. Merchants, bankers, and manufacturers were becoming wealthy, often wealthier than the landed gentry, but money alone wasn't enough to unlock high society. Respectability required fluency in the complex dialect of manners. To the rising middle class, etiquette offered something priceless: legitimacy. It was the bridge between the counting house and the country estate, between trade and taste. But that bridge was built on insecurity. The aristocracy guarded politeness like a trademarked brand, constantly inventing new, subtler rules to keep imitators one step behind. The moment the middle class mastered one form of refinement, a particular type of greeting, fashion, or turn of phrase, the elite declared it passé. It was social Darwinism in silk stockings. A merchant might spend a fortune soon learning how to bow correctly, only to discover that real gentlemen now favoured the more natural nod. For the aspirational Georgian, every social encounter was an audition. You were performing civility under pressure, and failure had consequences. If you laughed too heartily, you were vulgar. If you spoke too confidently, you were presumptuous. If you looked nervous, you were clearly new money. The goal was to seem effortlessly composed, even as your mind screamed, "Don't spill the tea, don't spill the tea." Etiquette books fed this anxiety like fire. Titles such as The Gentleman's Pocketbook of Decorum and The Female Instructor, a guide to politeness and refinement, promised salvation through self-discipline. They offered endless lists of do's and don'ts: how to enter a room, how to address a duke, how to sit without looking too eager. The message was clear. Perfection could be learned, but never felt. In middle-class homes, children grew up rehearsing manners as if training for battle. Sons were taught to shake hands with dignified warmth and never talk about business at dinner, which was cruel since business was all they knew. Daughters practiced how to curtsy, embroider, and endure conversation without speaking too much. Mothers ruled these households like generals of gentility, drilling everyone to behave above their station while pretending not to notice they were trying. And of course the houses themselves joined the performance. The Georgian middle class built polite architecture on a budget, miniature versions of aristocratic mansions complete with symmetrical windows and perfectly bland facades. Inside, drawing rooms were curated to radiate restraint, modestly elegant, tastefully furnished, and absolutely devoid of personality. Visitors were meant to see refinement, not individuality. Even the furniture was polite, quiet, symmetrical, and slightly judgmental. The rituals of politeness crept into every corner of life. Dinner parties, afternoon visits, and musical evenings became arenas for middle-class aspiration. A successful soiree could raise a family's social stock. A failed one could destroy it. Everything depended on execution. The food had to impress without flaunting extravagance. The conversation had to sparkle without controversy. And the hostess had to radiate serenity while mentally tracking who was gossiping about her upholstery. Men carried their own burdens of civility. A merchant might command hundreds of workers by day, only to be reduced to a trembling novice at a gentleman's club. He might have earned his fortune with sweat and cunning, but in the world of refinement, that was gauche. Politeness required him to pretend money simply appeared through ancestral grace, not enterprise. To talk about work was indecent. To talk about anything else convincingly was a full-time job. The result was an epidemic of performance fatigue. Diaries from the period reveal middle-class writers obsessing over minor social errors. An ill-timed remark, a clumsy bow, a dinner invitation that went unreciprocated. "I fear I appeared too attentive to the Duchess," one anxious guest wrote, "perhaps vulgar in my eagerness." Politeness was supposed to bring harmony, but it mostly produced ulcers. Satirists of the day had a field day with this genteel panic. Cartoonists like James Gilray depicted new money families swaddled in imitation luxury. Husbands in too bright waistcoats, wives dripping with mismatched jewels, children bowing at impossible angles. Playwrights filled theatres with social climbers mispronouncing bouquet or calling wine delicious, a word too passionate for polite use. The audience laughed nervously, because everyone knew they were only one faux pas away from ridicule themselves. Yet for all the ridicule, the system worked brutally well. The pursuit of politeness kept the social order intact. It gave the middle class ambition and the upper class reassurance. Everyone was locked in the same delicate dance, pretending that refinement came from moral superiority rather than relentless practice. Civility, once a virtue, had become a filter, the difference between being seen as civilized or merely aspiring. Still, there was something almost touching in the effort. Behind all the mimicry and anxiety lay a genuine faith in improvement. Politeness promised that anyone could refine themselves, that elegance was not just birthright, but discipline. The middle class might have been anxious, but they were also optimistic. If they couldn't inherit status, they could at least earn style. By the close of the century, Britain had become a nation of actors, each one playing a role written by etiquette. The upper class pretended they weren't terrified of vulgarity. The middle class pretended they weren't terrified of the upper class. Together, they built a society that worshipped composure and punished sincerity, and then congratulated itself on being enlightened. The good news, the Georgian dream of refinement made civility a national art form. The bad news, everyone lived in constant fear that their porcelain mask might crack. If the Georgian lady's battlefield was the tea table, the gentleman's was the conversation club, those candle-lit temples of wit, where men gathered to prove they were rational, refined, and, if possible, slightly more intelligent than everyone else. Politeness wasn't just about social grace. It was a performance of masculine control. The ideal Georgian man was calm, eloquent, and perpetually unruffled. Passion was dangerous, shouting was vulgar, and sincerity was for poets. Men gathered to discuss politics politely, which is to say, they took turns agreeing with each other for 6 hours. Across 18th century Britain, these clubs became the crucibles of polite masculinity. London alone was dotted with them. Coffee houses, salons, and elite societies where gentlemen tested their civility as though it were a sport. The famous ones, like the Royal Society, the Literary Club, and the Scriblerus Club, attracted the intellectual elite. Scientists, writers, politicians, and philosophers who debated everything from celestial mechanics to whether French manners were secretly contagious. But dozens of lesser-known groups existed too, gatherings of lawyers, merchants, and minor aristocrats all trying to sound cultured while subtly checking each other's cufflinks. Membership in a conversation club was both an honour and a hazard. You were expected to speak with precision, restraint, and irony, like a fencing master of language. Every word had to strike cleanly, leaving no emotional residue. Too blunt, and you were coarse. Too witty, and you were showy. The perfect conversationalist balanced intelligence with modesty, amusement with decorum. It was less about what you said and more about how smoothly you said it. In theory, these clubs were arenas of free thought. In practice, they were theatres of self-control. The rules of civility demanded moderation at all costs. A proper gentleman did not raise his voice, interrupt, or express violent opinions, even about things like taxation or religion. This was England, not France. Revolutions were to be discussed, not enacted. A heated argument might have threatened the delicate ecosystem of politeness, and no one wanted to be the man who made the port taste awkward. The most famous example of this polite male ideal was Samuel Johnson's Literary Club, founded in 1764 with the painter Joshua Reynolds. Its members, including Edmund Burke, Oliver Goldsmith, and later James Boswell, embodied the Enlightenment dream of reasoned debate. They met weekly at a tavern to enlighten each other's minds, which usually meant delivering beautifully phrased monologues while everyone else nodded appreciatively. Johnson himself was both admired and feared, brilliant, biting, and barely tolerating mediocrity. Yet even he played by the unspoken rule. Intellect must never tip into passion. Emotion was a foreign accent in the language of reason. And oh, how they loved to reason. Clubs prided themselves on their philosophical restraint, holding discussions so polite they risked slipping into catatonia. Debate might last 3 hours and end with unanimous agreement that both sides had made excellent points. Men congratulated themselves on being humblized enough to disagree politely, even if they hadn't actually disagreed. The Georgian gentleman's greatest fear wasn't being wrong, it was being undignified. Of course, there was an undercurrent of competition beneath all that courtesy. Clubs were social hierarchies in miniature, each meeting a subtle contest of reputation. Who spoke the most elegantly? Whose observation drew murmurs of approval? Who could quote Cicero without sounding like a bore? These gatherings were laboratories of status, where a man's wit could advance his standing as surely as inheritance or property. You didn't fight for dominance, you conversed for it. But it wasn't only about intellect, it was about character. Georgian ideals of masculinity demanded composure above all. The polite man was the master of himself, restrained in gesture, measured in tone, immune to both rage and sentimentality. A true gentleman could endure provocation without flinching, listen to nonsense without interrupting, and express contempt with nothing but a gentle indeed. This emotional discipline separated him from the vulgar male who shouted, sweated, and drank too much, or worse, showed enthusiasm. The culture of the club even reshaped male friendship. Gone were the rough camaraderies of earlier centuries. Georgian companionship was now filtered through decorum. Friends were expected to exchange ideas, not secrets. They discussed ethics, poetry, and the state of the empire, never feelings, which were strictly contraband. If two men shared a genuine emotional bond, they disguised it behind jokes about philosophy. Georgian masculinity was polite, polished, and profoundly lonely. The rise of these clubs also reflected Britain's changing world. The Enlightenment celebrated rational discourse, and conversation societies were its domestic echo, tiny parliaments of civility where men rehearsed leadership, or at least the appearance of it. To debate calmly was to prove one's fitness for power. Politeness became the badge of a civilized empire, as though courtesy itself could justify colonialism. After all, how barbaric could Britain be if its leaders discussed tyranny so eloquently over Port and Stilton? Not all conversation clubs were so lofty. Some were delightfully ridiculous. The Everlasting Club, for instance, claimed to meet continuously, its members taking turns so that someone was always in session, even at 3 a.m. Others, like the Beefsteak Club, mixed refinement with revelry, proving that even gentlemen occasionally needed to remind themselves they were human. Still, even the rowdiest gatherings observed the basic rules: no vulgarity, no emotion, and no mentioning trade. For middle-class men, joining a conversation club was social mobility disguised as intellect. For aristocrats, it was moral theatre, proof that they were more than idle hedonists. Either way, the ritual of polite debate reinforced the illusion that reason ruled the nation. In truth, the British elite were as competitive, insecure, and ego-driven as ever. They had just found a way to make it sound dignified. By the century's end, the conversation club had become a national symbol, the embodiment of British masculinity at its most polished, articulate, logical, and emotionally constipated. The good news? These men shaped modern ideas of diplomacy, reason, and civic debate. The bad news? They probably hadn't laughed sincerely in 20 years. For Georgian women, politeness wasn't optional. It was oxygen. Every smile, every glance, every movement of the wrist or tilt of the head had to signal composure, modesty, and moral virtue. A man could lose his temper and be called spirited. A woman could raise an eyebrow and be called scandalous. Her life was a performance on a stage built entirely from expectations, and the audience never blinked. You weren't allowed to express emotion unless it matched the wallpaper. In a world obsessed with refinement, women were seen as the natural guardians of manners, the moral ornaments of polite society. A well-bred lady wasn't supposed to have power, but she was expected to embody it. Soft-spoken, graceful, patient, and perpetually agreeable. She was civilization in a gown. Georgian men congratulated themselves on being rational and enlightened, but it was women who were forced to make those virtues visible every waking moment. From the moment she could stand, a Georgian girl was trained in the gospel of grace. Childhood was a boot camp in self-control. Dancing masters corrected her posture, governesses refined her speech, and mothers drilled her in deportment until serenity became muscle memory. Running, shouting, or laughing too loudly were exercised from her behaviour like moral diseases. Her entire body was trained to say one thing: I am good. But being good meant being watched. Society monitored women like hawks trained on etiquette manuals. A lady's reputation wasn't just about what she did, it was about how she appeared to feel while doing it. Emotions were dangerous things, best displayed only in tiny decorative doses. Joy was acceptable if it looked delicate. Sadness was dignified as long as it didn't disturb the powder on one's face. Anger, however, was strictly for men in Parliament. At dinner, a woman's role was to be the invisible oil that kept conversation turning. She laughed when appropriate, nodded when wise, and said little of consequence. To talk too much was unladylike. To talk too little was dull. The ideal tone hovered between fascination and faint disinterest, as if every topic, politics, philosophy, the decline of the British Empire, were mildly amusing, but not important enough to wrinkle one's expression. The pressure extended to fashion. While men's clothing reflected restraint and status, women's garments were physical prisons of decorum. Corsets restricted breath, stays enforced posture, and layers of fabric created silhouettes that turned women into sculptures of politeness. Their appearance screamed serenity while their lungs whispered help. A Georgian lady was expected to glide, never rush, to float across rooms as though gravity itself had been raised to her social level. Worse, her wardrobe was also her resume. Society read fabrics the way modern employers read CVs. Silk said wealth, cotton said moderation, velvet said arrogance. Jewellery had to gleam, but not flash. Lace had to be delicate, but not French, depending on the year's political mood. Every ribbon and pearl was a statement in moral geometry, elegant, symmetrical, and faintly oppressive. At home, politeness governed even solitude. Letters had to be written with composure, music practiced gracefully, embroidery done with calm concentration, because serenity was both a virtue and a brand. Women were told that good manners elevated them above the chaos of lower orders. The irony, of course, was that their politeness mostly served to keep them in their place. Courtship turned this pressure into art. A lady's flirtation had to be as subtle as vapour. A glance, a pause, the delicate tilt of a fan. Too forward and she was ruined, too cold and she was invisible. Men could pursue, flatter, and joke. Women could only react, gracefully, of course. The art of attraction was conducted through silence and implication, a kind of emotional charades that could determine one's entire future. And heaven help the woman who failed to perform. A single misstep, a laugh too hearty, a dress too bold, a dance too enthusiastic, could destroy a reputation overnight. The polite world forgave male indiscretion as human nature, but female imperfection was a scandal. The double standard was so deeply ingrained that politeness itself became gendered. He was polite because he chose to be. She was polite because she had no choice. Some women resisted quietly. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and Frances Burney exposed the suffocating absurdities of female civility. Wollstonecraft, in particular, tore into the idea that politeness was virtue, calling it artificial manners taught at the expense of sincerity. But for every woman bold enough to write about the problem, hundreds more endured it silently, perfecting their smiles while dreaming of rebellion. The greatest irony of all was that women were praised for their influence while being denied authority. They were told they ruled the home, yet even that rule came with strict instructions. Govern gently, smile constantly, and don't let anyone notice that you're managing everyone's emotions. The polite woman was expected to shape the moral character of her husband, her children, and society, all without raising her voice or acknowledging her labour. This wasn't just emotional pressure. It was existential theatre. Georgian women performed an ideal of humanity so flawless it excluded being human. They had to be angels in powdered wigs, creatures of reason and restraint, immune to fatigue, jealousy, or self-expression. Their very existence became a kind of polite suffering, silent, symmetrical, and utterly exhausting. By the end of the century, cracks were beginning to show. The sentimental novels of the era, once dismissed as feminine fluff, revealed how desperately women longed to feel again. To cry, to rage, to exist outside the delicate prison of grace. Politeness had given them poise, but it had stolen their voices. The good news, they looked like paragons of refinement. The bad news, they weren't allowed to blink too hard without social permission. In the Georgian world, where every word was weighed, every gesture monitored, and every feeling politely suffocated, romance had to find loopholes. Love, like everything else, was forced to speak in code. Enter the language of the fan, a fluttering, flickering vocabulary of glances, gestures, and silent confessions that turned accessories into weapons of seduction. One flutter meant, "I adore you." 2 meant, "I might faint." 3 meant, "This corset is a death trap." When Georgian women weren't allowed to speak their minds, they learned to speak with their wrists. The fan, glove, and parasol became the props of a silent rebellion, a wordless language that allowed women to flirt, refuse, tease, or even declare love under the watchful eyes of polite society. To the untrained observer, it looked like choreography. To those in the know, it was an entire romance novel told through fabric and feather. The fan was the queen of these tools, delicate, dangerous, and indispensable. Every lady carried one. It was as essential as a gown or a smile. In public gatherings, balls, theatres, promenades, fans were not merely cooling devices, but conversation weapons. Manuals even claimed to decode the system. Opening a fan slowly meant, "I wish to speak with you." Closing it abruptly meant, "Leave me alone." Tapping it against the cheek, "I love another." Fanning rapidly, "I am engaged." And if she dropped it entirely, well, that was less romance and more gravity's intervention. Of course, this language was probably more imaginative than universal, but the myth of it spread, and that's what mattered. The idea that women had invented a secret form of communication thrilled and terrified men in equal measure. A society obsessed with control had accidentally given women a tool of freedom, one they could wield right under everyone's powdered noses. At a Georgian ball where decorum reigned, and conversation was restricted to pleasantries about the weather, fans became the only legal form of rebellion. While men performed their polite bows and women endured their rehearsed smiles, the fans told another story, one of a whispered desire and mutual frustration. A woman could flirt openly while appearing perfectly modest. Her fan covered her mouth, concealing a smile or a smirk. Her eyes did the rest. It was emotional espionage in silk and ivory. Gloves, too, had their coded allure. In polite society, gloves symbolized purity and restraint, the literal covering of touch. To remove one in public was almost indecent, which of course made it thrilling. A gloved hand brushing a sleeve could electrify an entire conversation. A gentleman might kiss a lady's gloved fingers, but bare skin? That was the equivalent of a scandal. It's no wonder that Georgian romances describe such moments as if the world had tilted on its axis, because in their tightly wound social order, it had. Parasols joined the conspiracy in daylight. A lady strolling through a Georgian garden could angle her parasol just so to signal approval, or tilt it away to signal disinterest. Whether these gestures were truly standardized or simply improvised flirtation hardly mattered. The idea of secret meaning gave women power. It let them operate within the system while quietly rewriting the rules. The theatre was another breeding ground for this elegant subversion. Boxes filled with fashionable spectators doubled as miniature stages of flirtation. A woman could flutter her fan toward a gentleman across the room, feigning to adjust it while sending a message as blatant as a serenade. The fan became an alibi for attraction, the perfect prop in a world where women were not supposed to want. And yet the fan was also a tool of defense. If a suitor pressed too hard or lingered too long, a well-timed snap shut like a guillotine could end a conversation instantly. The fan allowed women to maintain boundaries with grace, rejecting advances without breaching decorum, in a society where saying no outright was scandalous. This fluttering diplomacy was both brilliant and necessary. Even literature caught on to the metaphor. In plays and novels, the fan became a symbol of duplicity, intrigue, and feminine wit. Playwrights like Richard Sheridan and Oliver Goldsmith filled their comedies with women who wielded fans like sabres, coquettish one moment, commanding the next. Satirists mocked the fan language as frivolous, but beneath the laughter was unease. The Georgian man prided himself on control, and here was an object held by women that could command a room without a single word. Manufacturers were quick to monetize the fascination. Fans were crafted with extraordinary artistry, painted with mythological scenes, landscapes, or delightfully hidden messages. Some even featured flirtation cheat sheets, tiny engravings of gestures and meaning tucked into the design. Parisian fan makers became celebrities, their creations fetching prices that could bankrupt a modest household. To own a particularly fine fan was not just fashionable, it was social currency. But for all their beauty, fans were fragile things, and so too was the power they symbolized. The language of flirtation existed only because society refused to let women speak freely. It was rebellion under constraint, clever, yes, but still confined. A lady might send secret messages across a ballroom, but she could not send them across a courtroom. Her intelligence could charm but not legislate. Still, within their limited sphere, women turned politeness into poetry. They found ways to express emotion in a world determined to suppress it, transforming restraint into art. Every flick of a fan, every turn of a parasol was a quiet declaration. You can silence me, but you cannot stop me from being heard. By the end of the Georgian century, the language of fans and flirtation had become legend, half truth, half fantasy, and entirely revealing. It showed how creativity thrives under pressure, how even within the iron corset of etiquette, desire found a way to breathe. The good news: women mastered the art of saying everything while saying nothing. The bad news: their wrists were exhausted from centuries of emotional semaphore. If Georgian society was one long performance of manners, then the theatre was where that performance was gleefully torn apart. The stage became a mirror that reflected all the bowing, fluttering and forced smiles of polite life, and then cracked that mirror into 1,000 ridiculous pieces. Playwrights, poets and novelists turned etiquette into entertainment, mocking the very system their audiences couldn't live without. Audiences laughed at fake politeness, then practiced it on the way home. The Georgian stage was one of the few places where hypocrisy could be safely exposed. Comedy was the weapon of choice, and no one wielded it sharper than Richard Brinsley Sheridan. His plays, especially The School for Scandal, 1777, skewered the entire culture of civility with surgical precision. His characters spoke the language of politeness fluently, compliments dripping with venom, gossip disguised as moral concern, charm concealing greed. The polite salon became a circus of self-interest. Sheridan didn't just parody manners, he revealed them as camouflage. Take Lady Sneerwell, who spreads rumours with a sweet smile, or Sir Benjamin Backbite, whose very name could curtsy. They were embodiments of Georgian society's paradox, polished on the outside, poisonous underneath. Sheridan's satire worked because the audience recognised themselves. They laughed at characters who flattered, bragged and preened, all while sitting in their theatre boxes, doing precisely the same thing. And the theatre itself was an arena of etiquette. Attending a play wasn't just about art, it was about being seen, seeing it. The fashionable elite arrived late, in carriages designed to be noticed, and spent half the evening observing each other through opera glasses. Applause was subdued, unless someone from one's social circle appeared on stage, in which case one clapped with the enthusiasm of a dying swan. Even laughter had rules. To laugh too loudly was to reveal vulgar joy. To not laugh at all risked seeming ignorant. The theatre audience was as much a performance as the play itself. Beyond Sheridan, satire flourished everywhere. Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer, 1773, mocked the stiff formalities of courtship and class. The hero mistakes a manor house for an inn, the gentry for servants, and chaos ensues. The moral: good manners are meaningless without sincerity. The audience roared with laughter, perhaps relieved that for once a social disaster didn't happen to them. Even poetry joined the rebellion. Alexander Pope, earlier in the century, had perfected the art of slicing through pretension with verse. His Rape of the Lock turned a petty aristocratic squabble, the cutting of a lady's curl, into a mock epic that parodied the grandeur of polite society. What mighty contests rise from trivial things, Pope wrote, and Britain laughed, nervously. His heroic couplets exposed how absurdly inflated Georgian values had become. Wars of words, duels of etiquette, tragedies over trifles, all played out under chandeliers and powdered wigs. Satirical prints were the visual counterpart to this literary mockery. Artists like William Hogarth and later James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson transformed Georgian manners into grotesque cartoons. Hogarth's Marriage a la Mode depicted a polite couple so busy being fashionable they ruin their lives before the second act. Gilray took aim at the hypocrisy of the elite, genteel dinners turning into drunken chaos, aristocrats with wigs as large as their egos, ladies fainting theatrically at a gossip they had started themselves. These prints sold by the thousands, decorating the homes of the very people being mocked. Even novelists got in on the act. Jane Austen, writing at the tail end of the Georgian period, mastered the subtle satire of politeness. Her heroines navigated drawing rooms like battlefields, using conversation as both shield and sword. Austen understood that manners weren't just social niceties, they were survival tactics. When Elizabeth Bennet skewers Darcy with wit, or Emma Woodhouse fumbles her way through matchmaking disasters, they are living proof that politeness was both a mask and a minefield. Austen's genius lay in her restraint. She didn't condemn manners, she revealed how they constrained and occasionally liberated those who used them well. But while writers mocked politeness, they also depended on it. The very success of satirical plays and novels rested on the audience's intimate knowledge of the system being ridiculed. The jokes worked only because everyone recognised the rules. A single exaggerated bow, a pompous compliment, a misused title. These were the punchlines of a shared cultural language. Georgian humour wasn't about rebellion, it was about self-recognition. The laughter that filled the theatres and reading rooms was a kind of social exorcism, a temporary release from the suffocating pressure of always being proper. Still, the satire had a moral edge. Beneath the laughter was genuine anxiety. Could a society obsessed with appearances still tell the difference between sincerity and deceit? Sheridan's hypocrites, Pope's narcissists, Austen's social climbers, they all asked the same question. What happens when politeness becomes the only truth people recognise? Even sermons and essays joined the debate. Moralists like Samuel Johnson warned that civility without virtue was painted hypocrisy. The philosopher David Hume, meanwhile, defended politeness as a necessary social glue, a system of mutual restraint that made civilization possible. Between these poles, sincerity and performance, the Georgian world wobbled precariously, laughing nervously at its own reflection. By the end of the 18th century, politeness had become both punchline and principle. The theatre lights dimmed, the audience applauded, and everyone returned to their carriages still performing their parts, their smiles freshly polished, their laughter freshly practiced. The good news? The Georgians invented the modern art of social satire. The bad news? They never stopped rehearsing the joke. As Britain expanded its empire across the globe, it didn't just export gunpowder, tea and taxation, it exported politeness, that intricate web of etiquette, restraint and superiority that had already conquered the Georgian heart. Civility became a soft weapon, polishing conquest until it gleamed like virtue. The British called it civilizing. Everyone else might have called it what it was, cultural colonization with lace cuffs. Nothing says refinement like conquering politely. By the mid-18th century, as ships sailed out from London, Bristol and Liverpool, they carried more than muskets and spices. They carried manuals of manners, imported tea sets, and the smug conviction that good posture equalled moral supremacy. Empire, after all, was easier to justify if you could convince yourself you were spreading grace. Conquest could be rewritten as instruction, a genteel way of saying, "We've come to take your land, but we'll teach you how to pour tea first." For the British elite, politeness was the moral sugar that made empire taste noble. The word civilization itself shared roots with civility. To be polite was to be civilized. To be unpolished was to be primitive. This logic provided the perfect alibi for expansion. As long as the British kept their pinkies raised, they could claim moral high ground even while planting flags in other people's gardens. Colonial governors, soldiers and traders thus became ambassadors of manners. In India, officers dined in formal attire under sweltering heat, conducting themselves as if Buckingham Palace itself were watching. Napkins, waistcoats and measured conversation persisted even in jungles and deserts. Dinner was served at the right hour, candles flickered elegantly and the orchestra of politeness played on, while outside entire civilizations were being rearranged. In the Caribbean, planters hosted balls in imitation of London salons, complete with powdered wigs and minuets, while enslaved workers toiled outside to fund the refinement. The Georgian obsession with grace reached absurd levels. Letters survive of colonial wives lamenting the lack of suitable company for tea in regions where local populations vastly outnumbered them. The irony was staggering. They sought to civilize lands that had been thriving long before Britain discovered forks. This colonial politeness wasn't just hypocrisy, it was policy. The empire governed through etiquette as much as through force. Colonial officers were trained to manage natives with a blend of charm and condescension, the so-called white man's manners that accompanied the white man's burden. They wrote long dispatches about teaching courtesy while ignoring the violence that enforced it. The British believed that teaching someone to bow properly somehow erased the indignity of making them bow at all. At home, this exported civility became a source of pride. The British public loved tales of officers conducting afternoon tea in Calcutta or missionaries insisting on proper table manners in West Africa. These stories reassured the nation that empire was not brutality but benevolence, that politeness itself could justify domination. It wasn't conquest, it was conversion to refinement. Of course, colonial subjects quickly learned that politeness was a one-way street. To mimic British manners too well was suspicious. To ignore them was barbaric. Those who mastered the codes of civility, the elites educated in English schools, dressed in waistcoats and quoting Milton, were both admired and ridiculed. The British wanted the empire to reflect them, but never to rival them. Civility, like tea, was meant to be served, not shared. In India, this contradiction birthed entire generations of English-educated bureaucrats who knew the rules of British decorum better than most Britons. They spoke softly, wrote elegantly, and ran the empire's machinery with politeness so impeccable it was almost subversive. Colonial politeness became its own strange dialect, half mimicry, half rebellion. In time, it would turn against its makers. After all, the same poise that once proved submission could just as easily prove competence. Meanwhile, in colonial society, etiquette became a way to draw invisible lines. Who could dine with whom, sit where, or even stand how? Politeness replaced outright hostility as a subtler form of exclusion. It was no longer keep out, but you are, of course, most welcome, just not at this table. The empire learned that control didn't always require chains. Sometimes it only needed a perfectly worded invitation that never quite arrived. Back in Britain, politeness was the empire's most flattering mirror. The Georgian elite congratulated themselves on their civility, contrasting their calm reason with what they called native passions. London drawing rooms filled with talk of improvement and moral progress, while cargo ships returned from colonies stacked with the profits of coerced labour. It was the world's most elegant paradox, brutality dressed in brocade. Writers noticed. Satirists like Jonathan Swift and later poets of the Romantic era skewered the genteel veneer of empire. Swift's Gulliver's Travels imagined polite explorers bringing reason to foreign lands, only to expose their own absurd arrogance. By the early 19th century, even as Georgian manners evolved into Victorian morality, the tension remained. Could a nation that prided itself on courtesy reconcile that with conquest? The answer, of course, was yes, as long as you did it quietly and with good diction. Politeness became the empire's costume, a velvet glove over an iron trade network. Britain taught etiquette abroad while exploiting those who learned it, turning refinement into propaganda. Yet in the long run, this civilizing mission backfired. The colonized absorbed the tools of civility, the language, the rhetoric, the diplomacy, and used them to challenge imperial authority. Revolutions began not with rebellion but with petitions written in perfect English, signed, "Your obedient servant." The great irony of Georgian politeness was that it travelled too well. It was meant to be a badge of British superiority. Instead, it became a universal language of dignity and resistance. The empire had exported not just manners, but the means to mimic and undermine them. The good news: the British conquered the world and remembered to say please. The bad news: everyone else learned to say no thank you, just as politely. If the Georgian era had an unofficial motto, it might have been, "Be kind in public." The age of politeness prided itself on civility, grace, and composure. But beneath the satin veneer lay a swamp of gossip, cruelty, and quiet sabotage. Behind every delicate smile hid sharpened tongues. It wasn't just that people lied, it's that they lied beautifully. Everyone was polite until you left the room, then they were very polite about your flaws. Politeness had become a currency, and like any economy, it depended on manipulation. To survive in Georgian high society, one had to master the art of performative sincerity, appearing generous while being strategic, warm while quietly calculating, charming while quietly judging. Civility wasn't about goodness, it was about control. Those who could flatter gracefully could rise just as quickly as those who inherited titles. Those who failed to mask their contempt with a smile risked social extinction. The dinner party was the perfect theatre for hypocrisy. Guests toasted friendship with a rehearsed warmth while silently cataloguing each other's fashion crimes, table manners, and seating placement. Compliments were daggers in disguise. "How lovely your gown looks tonight," often translated to, "I can't believe you wore that again," and "You look so well" was the universal Georgian euphemism for, "You look surprisingly alive." Gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was sport. Politeness created a culture where one could never confront, only insinuate. Directness was considered barbaric, so venom had to be delivered with velvet. Drawing rooms buzzed with the polite warfare of rumour. Who had danced twice with whose husband, whose debts had grown scandalous, whose smile was a little too bright. Everyone condemned gossip while contributing to it. In a society obsessed with appearances, destroying someone's reputation was as simple as phrasing an insult like a compliment and letting the room fill in the rest. Letters were no safer. The same society that turned correspondence into an art form also turned it into a weapon. Private notes circulated through London like time-delayed grenades, written with impeccable calligraphy and brimming with malicious grace. It pains me to mention that Lady H's nerves seem unsettled, could end a marriage faster than any duel. And if a letter was discovered, the author could simply claim it was written out of concern. No era ever wrapped cruelty in such exquisite stationery. Theatre and salons reflected this duality perfectly. Outwardly, politeness promised civility and unity. In practice, it fostered paranoia. A Georgian gentleman might preach virtue in public, then spend his evening mocking his friend's manners. A lady might feign sympathy while subtly demolishing a rival's character over tea. The great unspoken rule of the age was simple: never let honesty ruin elegance. What made this hypocrisy so effective was its plausibility. The politest people were often the most dangerous, because they understood the value of tone. Outrage delivered with grace was twice as lethal. You could humiliate someone simply by not acknowledging them, by bowing too shallowly, or by omitting their name from an invitation list. Georgian cruelty wasn't loud, it was administrative. Even moral philosophers noticed the problem. Writers like Lord Chesterfield, who famously advised his son to polish his manners as armour, understood that politeness wasn't about kindness but strategy. To him, the polite man was superior because he could conceal his emotions, manipulate perception, and bend situations in his favour without ever appearing coarse. In other words, politeness made hypocrisy look noble. Meanwhile, satirists gleefully exposed the rot beneath the refinement. Jonathan Swift, Henry Fielding, and Sheridan painted their polite characters as charming monsters, people who spoke of virtue while chasing self-interest. Swift's famous essay, A Modest Proposal, in which he politely suggests eating poor children to solve famine, was a masterpiece of moral inversion. Savage honesty delivered in the language of civility. The message was clear: the Georgian obsession with manners had reached such absurdity that one could suggest cannibalism, and as long as it was written politely, no one would faint. This double standard infected every layer of society. The clergy thundered about morality while attending exclusive dinners. Philosophers preached self-control while exploiting servants. Politicians praised reason and restraint while selling influence behind the scenes. The polite world rewarded duplicity and punished candor. Honesty was gauche, and passion was poor form. You could ruin a person with perfect decorum, and everyone would applaud your restraint. At its core, the hypocrisy of politeness wasn't accidental. It was functional. The system needed to look peaceful while being ruthless. Civility acted as social anesthesia, numbing the sting of inequality and rivalry. By pretending that everyone was equal in grace, Georgian society disguised the fact that almost no one was equal in power. As long as everyone kept smiling, the hierarchy could hold. Yet this endless performance came at a cost. Beneath the surface calm, anxiety simmered. Diaries from the time are filled with exhaustion, the mental toll of constant self-monitoring, the fear of misstep, the quiet loneliness of never speaking honestly. Many Georgians lived surrounded by friends, yet died convinced they'd never been known. Politeness gave them protection, but denied them intimacy. The hypocrisy reached its poetic peak at funerals, ceremonies of tears delivered with restraint. Even grief had etiquette. People complimented each other's composure while silently assessing the quality of mourning clothes. Death too had to be dignified. The ultimate irony, even in tragedy, no one dared wrinkle the social fabric. By the end of the 18th century, this polished falseness had become national character, a mixture of charm and repression that foreigners found both impressive and unsettling. To outsiders, the British seemed impossibly polite. To insiders, they were quietly exhausted. The good news? Everyone got along, at least on the surface. The bad news? Underneath that surface was a world of smiles sharp enough to cut glass. By the late 18th century, Georgian Britain had perfected the art of politeness so completely that it stopped being a social code and became something stranger, a performance. Everyone, from the aristocrat to the aspiring merchant, was an actor on the grand stage of civility. The gestures were rehearsed, the smiles choreographed, and the dialogue strictly scripted. By century's end, manners weren't merely practiced, they were performed. Society became one giant masquerade where no one remembered their real face. It was an age when appearances ruled with velvet-gloved tyranny. Every public encounter was a scene in an ongoing drama of grace. You didn't just dine, you performed dining. You didn't visit friends, you played friendship. Even emotions were cast in roles. Joy was graceful, sadness was elegant, anger was forbidden. The theatre hadn't just influenced Georgian society, it had consumed it. The same people who filled playhouses to watch Sheridan's comedies returned home to act in their own. The drawing room was the most polished stage of all. Every guest entered as though stepping into a spotlight. Men bowed with studied precision. Women curtsied in perfect symmetry. Conversation flowed like scripted dialogue. Light, witty, and never too real. There were rules about how far to lean forward, how long to smile, how wide to laugh. Politeness had become choreography. It wasn't about connection, it was about applause. This transformation didn't happen by accident. The 18th century's explosion of theatres, novels, and printed advice manuals blurred the line between performance and personality. London's West End staged refinement nightly, with actors imitating the speech, posture, and elegance of the elite. The audience, eager to appear just as sophisticated, began imitating the actors. Society, in short, started plagiarizing itself. Even fashion joined the act. Clothing no longer expressed individuality. It broadcasted allegiance to the aesthetic of civility. Powdered wigs, waistcoats, and gowns became costumes of composure. The rich wore layers of lace, silk, and self-control, while the middle class mimicked the same look in cheaper fabric. The entire nation dressed for a play that never ended. A gentleman's coat said, "I am rational." A lady's gown said, "I am serene." but what they both meant was, I belong. Letters from the period reveal a growing sense of exhaustion with this polite pantomime. One weary diarist complained, "We all converse as if on a stage, every sentence measured, every gesture rehearsed, until sincerity itself feels indecent." Others echoed the same fatigue, the crushing weight of self-awareness, the fear of slipping out of character, the constant dread that someone might notice a real emotion. Georgian society didn't just fear vulgarity, it feared authenticity. At dinner parties, guests competed not for pleasure but for poise. The food was elaborate, but the real feast was performance. The host was a director, cueing servants and smiles with impeccable timing. The guests, meanwhile, acted their parts, the modest philosopher, the sparkling wit, the gentle listener. To break character, to reveal boredom, irritation or hunger, was to fail socially. If you were lucky, you'd be dismissed as eccentric. If you weren't, you'd be quietly erased from future guest lists. Public life followed the same pattern. Politicians delivered speeches dripping with moral elegance while conducting private deals that stank of hypocrisy. Scholars gave lectures about rational restraint while dueling over footnotes. Clergymen preached humility in tones that implied divine self-satisfaction. The entire ruling class moved through life as though auditioning for the part of virtuous gentleman, a role nobody truly believed in, yet everyone had to play. The theatre mirrored this beautifully. Plays of the period, from Sheridan to Goldsmith to sentimental dramas, were obsessed with the difference between appearance and truth. The characters wore masks, sometimes literal, sometimes social, and the audience saw themselves reflected in every line. Ironically, the more Georgian society mocked its own artifice, the more addicted it became to it. Satire didn't cure the disease, it glamorized it. Even private relationships became performance art. Love letters were written not to express affection, but to demonstrate literacy and restraint. Marriages were negotiated like casting choices. Which couple looked the part of success? Parents coached their children's every expression for public presentation. A single unguarded moment, an eye roll, a clumsy laugh, an unfashionable sneeze, could undo years of social effort. Behind this obsession lay fear. Fear of exposure, fear of exclusion, fear that one's carefully constructed persona might collapse. The more people performed politeness, the less they trusted one another. Everyone was acting, but no one knew who the audience really was. Politeness had promised harmony. Instead, it created paranoia. If you were constantly being watched, you made sure to behave and to never stop performing. By the final decades of the century, critics began to notice that society had become a self-perpetuating masquerade. Writers spoke of theatrical manners and the comedy of life. Philosopher Adam Smith, usually calm to the point of saintliness, complained that people had become actors of virtue rather than possessors of it. The Enlightenment had told humanity to master its passions. The Georgians took that advice and turned it into theatre tickets. Yet for all its artificiality, there was something magnificent about this collective performance. The Georgian age understood the power of presentation, that how you behaved could shape not just perception, but identity. In mastering appearances, they mastered influence. Their performance may have been hollow, but it built an empire, defined an era, and gave Britain its enduring image of elegance under pressure. Still, beneath the chandeliers and powdered calm, a quiet disillusionment spread. The masks were heavy, the stage lights of society burned hot. People longed for sincerity, but no longer knew how to express it. The century that had once worshipped grace ended yearning for something messier, more human. The good news? The Georgians turned daily life into art. The bad news? No one could find the exit when the curtain fell. By the turn of the 19th century, the powdered calm of Georgian politeness began to crack, and through the fissures poured something shocking, unruly, and wonderfully wet. Emotion. After a century of restraint, people started wanting to feel again. No more rehearsed smiles, no more polite repression. Enter the Romantics, a generation of poets, painters, and philosophers who declared war on artificial civility and replaced it with passion. Suddenly it was okay to have feelings again, preferably while standing in the rain. For decades, Georgian manners had treated emotion as something to be tamed, a dangerous animal best hidden behind a fan or a bow. But as the Enlightenment faded, a new mood swept through Britain. The Romantics rejected the logic and order that had defined polite society and embraced the stormy chaos of the human heart. Sensibility, sincerity, and spontaneity became the new badges of virtue. Politeness was out. Feeling was in. The change was cultural whiplash. Where the Georgians prized symmetry and self-control, the Romantics adored wildness in nature, art, and the soul. They looked at the manicured lawns of politeness and said, "Let's tear that up and plant feelings instead." And they meant it literally. The same upper classes who once discussed the moral geometry of architecture now took long, damp walks through wind-swept moors, communing with sheep and thunderclouds. Poets led the rebellion. Wordsworth wandered lonely as a cloud, insisting that true beauty lay not in perfect manners but in raw experience. Byron refused to bow to anyone except maybe his own reflection. Shelley railed against hypocrisy. Keats swooned over mortality, and Coleridge took laudanum and invented half the English language before breakfast. These were men who wore their hearts on their ruffled sleeves, and sometimes forgot their sleeves entirely. Their message was simple but revolutionary. Sincerity mattered more than civility. The polite world's obsession with appearances, hierarchy, and restraint was suffocating the human spirit. Better to be honest and dishevelled than polished and false. In an age where everyone had learned to smile on cue, the Romantics championed tears, tempests, and truth. The backlash against politeness was visible everywhere. Conversation shifted from practiced wit to emotional confession. Where Georgian hosts once fretted over the correct placement of forks, Romantic salons preferred passionate arguments about art, nature, and the soul. Dinner parties that had once been polite choreography turned into verbal brawls about poetry. It was liberating and occasionally exhausting. Even fashion joined the emotional revolution. Gone were the powdered wigs, corsets, and pastel silks of Georgian civility. In came tousled curls, loose collars, and clothing that looked one gust away from poetic ruin. To be unkempt was suddenly authentic. The Romantic man was supposed to look like he had just emerged from a storm, having wrestled his own soul and narrowly survived. The Romantic woman, meanwhile, was encouraged to be pale, wistful, and permanently on the verge of composing a sonnet about a tree. This new era also redefined virtue. Where Georgian politeness had equated morality with manners, the Romantics insisted that morality came from feeling, compassion, empathy, and moral imagination. Better an honest sinner than a polite hypocrite could have been their motto. The old code of deportment gave way to the cult of authenticity. Being well-bred no longer impressed. Being well-felt did. The shift unsettled the establishment. To the remaining defenders of Georgian civility, this new generation looked dangerously unstable. Emotion was unpredictable. Politeness had kept chaos at bay. Now chaos was fashionable. One critic sneered that romanticism was the triumph of tears over taste. Yet even the critics couldn't resist the allure of sincerity. After decades of social theatre, the audience was tired of acting. The decline of politeness wasn't just aesthetic, it was philosophical. The Enlightenment belief in universal reason gave way to romantic faith in individual experience. The polite man had once been the model citizen, rational and composed. The romantic individual now became the moral ideal, passionate, introspective, and gloriously irrational. In literature, in art, and even in politics, emotion became the new evidence of truth. The polite conversation gave way to the heartfelt confession, and nowhere was this shift more symbolic than in nature. The Georgians had treated landscapes as decor, something to be trimmed, measured, and admired from a safe distance. The Romantics dove headfirst into them. They climbed mountains, painted storms, and wrote love letters to rivers. The polite garden was replaced by the sublime wilderness, messy, magnificent, and entirely uncontrollable. Civilization had spent a century perfecting symmetry. Now it rediscovered awe. Of course, the pendulum didn't swing gently. The new freedom to feel came with its own excesses. Melancholy became fashionable. Poets died young. Artists despaired beautifully. And half of Europe seemed to be suffering from meaningful heartbreak. Where the Georgians feared emotion, the Romantics worshipped it, and occasionally drowned in it. Still, their rebellion marked a turning point. The age of politeness had collapsed under the weight of its own perfection, and in its place bloomed a messy, magnificent humanity. Yet traces of Georgian civility lingered, ghost-like, in the background. Even as poets declared war on etiquette, society still bowed and curtsied. Drawing rooms still glimmered with polite conversation, just with a bit more sighing. Britain hadn't entirely abandoned its manners. It had simply learned to perform emotion as beautifully as it once performed grace. By the dawn of the 19th century, the age of politeness had given way to the age of passion. The carefully powdered facade had melted into rain-soaked sincerity. The good news? You could finally cry in public without losing your social standing. The bad news? You were now expected to make it sound profound. The Georgian obsession with manners may have faded with powdered wigs and candlelit dinners, but its ghost is alive and well and lurking in office emails, customer service voices, and every overly cheerful no worries at all you've ever received. Modern civility, from customer smiles to email etiquette, still echoes this age. The Georgians walked so we could say best regards while secretly seething. The 18th century gave politeness its shape. The 21st century gave it Wi-Fi. We may not wear lace cuffs or curtsy before speaking, but we still live by their unspoken rule: always appear composed. Politeness, once a moral weapon of class warfare, has evolved into a professional necessity, an invisible code that dictates tone, phrasing, and emoji selection. Georgian grace has been rebranded as a customer satisfaction. Take the modern workplace. Georgian drawing rooms demanded smooth conversation, careful posture, and subtle flattery. Today's boardrooms and inboxes demand the same, only now the quills are wireless. When we write just circling back, we are performing the 21st century equivalent of a Georgian bow, deferential, smiling, and strategically insincere. The polite lie, no problem at all, is the descendant of delighted to see you, muttered by someone who very much wasn't. Email in particular is where the Georgian spirit thrives. Every dear sir or madam could have come straight from an 18th century letterbook. We still apologise preemptively, so sorry for the delay, still couch criticism and compliments. This is great, but, and still end every message with ritual sign-offs designed to maintain dignity while avoiding conflict. Yours sincerely has simply evolved into kind regards, a phrase that sounds friendly but drips with quiet exhaustion. If Lord Chesterfield had used Outlook, he'd have written the same way, only with more italics. Customer service is another Georgian echo chamber. In polite Britain, civility once separated the refined from the rude. Now it separates the employed from the unemployed. Retail workers are trained to embody the same composure Georgian servants once perfected, smiling through insult, apologising for problems they didn't cause, and thanking people who probably shouldn't be thanked. Have a wonderful day is the modern equivalent of a Georgian servant's bow, both a gesture of grace and a shield of survival. Social media, ironically, has made politeness performative again. The digital masquerade ball. Online, everyone curates tone, filters emotion, and performs goodness in public while saving real opinions for the group chat. Likes are the new bows, and subtweets the new gossip pamphlets. Georgian London had coffee houses buzzing with rumour. We have comment sections buzzing with passive-aggressive civility. With all due respect, has survived 250 years as the world's most polite declaration of war. Even our language of professionalism is steeped in Georgian ideals. Emotional intelligence, tone management, and maintaining composure under pressure would sound right at home in an 18th century etiquette manual. We still reward the ability to hide discomfort elegantly, to disagree without sounding disagreeable, to express frustration in perfectly balanced prose. Modern corporate life has turned the Georgian performance of self-control into an industry. The only difference, now it's paid hourly. Our social rituals, too, echo their obsession with presentation. Networking events are just Georgian assemblies with better lighting, strangers circling each other with forced smiles, exchanging compliments they don't mean, and silently ranking everyone's outfits. Even dating apps borrow from Georgian codes of courtship, restrained introductions, polite messaging, and the delicate dance of showing interest without showing desperation. Georgian flirtation had fans, we have typing bubbles, and like the Georgians, we still use politeness as moral camouflage. Courtesy remains our favourite disguise for manipulation. Companies ruin your weekend plans with cheerful, urgent emails. Politicians weaponize charm with the same skill Sheridan's characters once mocked. Online influencers sell authentic kindness with the precision of a Georgian hostess arranging flowers for admiration. Behind every smooth tone still lurks strategy. The script has changed, but the plot hasn't. Yet, just like in the 18th century, this endless civility takes a toll. Politeness remains emotionally expensive, the art of swallowing irritation for the sake of social harmony. The Georgian anxiety about appearing vulgar has evolved into our fear of being unprofessional. We edit ourselves constantly, curating tone and posture for invisible audiences. Even sincerity now feels risky. If the Georgians feared sneezing wrong, we fear sending an email without a smiley. But there's a paradox at the heart of this inheritance. For all its artifice, politeness still works. It's the lubricant of civilization, the fragile thread that keeps societies from shouting themselves apart. Georgian thinkers like Addison and Hume believe civility was what separated reason from chaos. And in an era of comment wars and public meltdowns, they may still be right. Our polite facades might be exhausting, but they're also stabilizing. Without them, Twitter might spontaneously combust. Modern Britain, in particular, still carries the Georgian DNA of restraint. The national character, calm, apologetic, and quietly judgmental, is the long shadow of the 18th century. The British sorry is the Georgian bow of the modern age. A reflex, a social lubricant, and occasionally a passive-aggressive weapon. Abroad, this cultural legacy survives too. The international language of diplomacy, customer service, and LinkedIn courtesy all trace back to an era when saying the right thing mattered more than meaning it. Yet maybe the real legacy of Georgian politeness isn't hypocrisy, but adaptation. Every age finds its own version of civility to survive chaos. The Georgians used manners to control class anxiety. We use them to manage digital overload. They feared being vulgar, we fear being cancelled. The stage is different, but the performance continues. The good news, we've learned to express our frustrations with civility. The bad news, we still have to. The Georgians would be proud and mildly appalled.